Don't get all hysterical, honey.
Grand Theft Auto 5 will never die. The newest installment of video gaming's iconic open-world criminal action franchise, a modern tribute to sun-baked SoCal culture, Hollywood celebrity, and every gangster film of the past 30 years, is the second best-selling game of all time. Upon debut, it immediately became a cultural event for video gaming, ultimately earning publisher-developer Rockstar and its parent company Take-Two billions of gamers' dollars. Rockstar reveled in the success of the game so much that despite rumors of work proceeding behind the scenes, they've only recently announced active development on a successor. This game is nearly a decade old and set to debut on a third generation of console hardware, rallying the patience of many fans and drawing some ire away from the slightly older Skyrim's persistent reissues. Rockstar embraced the insane profitability of the game's online mode that launched a month later, branded Grand Theft Auto Online, but this review isn't designed to cover the multiplayer, so if you want hot takes on shark cards or Dr. Dre's motion-captured contributions to the series, you'll have to look elsewhere. Over the past decade, the Houser brothers instead directed Rockstar's constellation of international studios to build a sequel to Red Dead Redemption instead of a new Grand Theft Auto. In this review, we're going to look at the single-player game that dropped on store shelves in September 2013, with all the enhancements that came with the 2015 next-gen re-release on PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. We're going to see how Rockstar built my favorite game in the franchise, the lessons they learned from earlier games, where this game succeeded, where it's aged poorly, and where it's left me itching for more. We're also going to explore what Grand Theft Auto 6 will need to be successful and, more importantly, relevant in a new age of not just video gaming, but in a world that's seen a whole hell of a lot in the past couple years. Grand Theft Auto 5 is a massive game, rumored to be the most expensive ever produced when it released. It would be so easy to spend countless hours mining every last feature and detail that Rockstar built for it, but in true Nth Review fashion, our goal isn't to draw out the what of this mega hit, because that's been covered to death elsewhere. Instead, I want to understand the why and how this game works. We're going to look at the technology that made the game possible, the magic that made the game's trademark heists so thrilling, and the story that Dan Houser and Robert Humphries wrote that drives the game's narrative, for better and worse. So get yourself comfortable, because we've got a lot of road to travel and plenty of filthy crimes to commit. It may not be the first, but it is the Nth Review number 16 for Grand Theft Auto 5, brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/the Nth Review.
You should get some help with that personality of yours.
Every man has his talents, Maud, and the rigorous administration of justice.
Man, that's not exactly a great sales pitch, dog, but I guess I gotta start somewhere.
That's over now. You're off the grid. You're one of the invisible people.
Nothing increases funding for fighting terrorism more than successful acts of terrorism.
He's out of hell walking on Earth. That's what he is. Well, now it's payback time, you lying turd.
Yeah, whatever, homie.
Despite how popular the Grand Theft Auto series is, you may have heard of it, Rockstar has been notoriously secretive about providing any kind of internal geometry to the black box that is their game production machine. That said, I cannot recommend No Clips documentary enough on the life and times of DMA Design, the Scottish developer best known for Lemmings before their transformation into Rockstar North. Danny O'Dwyer talks with a number of the studio's founders and early employees and details not just how Grand Theft Auto came about, but the establishment of the brain trust that allowed it to happen. I've put it in the description below, but to really contextualize what this review is going to get into, I'd highly recommend you pause this video and go watch it. And then come back here and watch this video to the end, and like and subscribe. Since Rockstar is cagey about how their series works beyond the delivered results, this is the perfect time for me to reflect on my experience with the series, because I remember the first two Grand Theft Autos via the full-page ads in my monthly PC Gamer magazine. Both games are free through Rockstar, although I couldn't quite get the first game to run on this machine despite Googling. That first game in particular, something highlighted through the no-clip documentary, is a really hecking violent and energetic romp, a true embodiment of crime committing. Just years after the controversies of Doom and Mortal Kombat's 16-bit violence, and the creation of the ESRB to rate that content. Where my Grand Theft Auto experience really begins is in the fall of 2001, because GTA3 had come out exclusively on the PlayStation 2, and I was an Xbox guy waiting for his console to launch. This game was kind of a big deal, because not only had we migrated from 2.5D into a fully 3D video game environment, but 3 had been produced by a different team than the second game at the newly created Rockstar North. 3's team was also headed by designer-producer Leslie Benzies, a figure who would be tied to Rockstar's successes through GTA 5 before their messy, expensive divorce. 3 was a sea change, multiple waves over. I was a senior in high school at the time and my classmates would not shut the fuck up about that stupid game. Out of pure spite, I went and bought a boxed copy of Grand Theft Auto 2 on PC, which was easy because I worked retail and got a nice employee discount. Let's never mind that it was practically in the bargain bin by then. Meanwhile, the number of people who were buying PlayStation 2 consoles for Grand Theft Auto 3 at work was escalating on the repetition of a simple sales pitch.
You can pick up hookers in your car and have sex with them, and then afterwards beat them up and take your money back.
Over and over, that's what people wanted from this game. That was their killer app. They got a lot more, of course, but you couldn't do anything like that in Grand Theft Auto 2, the crime game I'd had to settle with. Well, settling with GTA 2 is really papering it over. It's a pretty brutal game without any of its sequel's big advantages. You need $50,000 to even save your progress in the game, which is a lot of money when you're starting from scratch. You also die easily, so you're basically investing 20 to 30 minutes just to say that you played for 20 to 30 minutes. You didn't save cars or have garages, and there isn't a narrative really, and there aren't any hookers, but holy hell can you cause some chaos. It does have some really interesting ideas about dynamic gang warfare and relationships, and I thought that was neat. Unfortunately, the package as a whole is a dark and nasty game that's not very fun at all. And let's be honest, once you've played Grand Theft Auto 3, even if it doesn't let you conjure the cataclysmic arcadey chaos of the second game, you can't go home again. That Liberty City just felt like a real place. You get Joey Pants voicing a mobster, you can plant bombs in cars, there are missions with actual characters and they provide structure, even if the story as a whole is just a chain of these quest givers one after the other. People love this arrangement so much that Rockstar dressed it up in neon, licensed all of our favorite childhood pop songs, and remember, we were young elder millennials at the time, and let us experience the joys of Vice City just a year later. Both of these games did end up on the Xbox with better graphics and reduced load times by the end of 2003, but by then we were all kinda over it. San Andreas is the only mainline game I haven't put any time into, and it came out nearly opposite Halo 2, so you can see which one I voted for with my wallet. Of course, you better believe I was there when we had to shove all those sealed copies of San Andreas back into plastic totes after it was re-rated AO in the wake of the whole hot coffee scandal. San Andreas survived the controversy, returned to shelves, and still sold tens of millions of copies, so it was no surprise that Grand Theft Auto 4 would be a big deal in 2008. The Xbox 360 was also a big deal, and it would have been stupid of Rockstar to keep it exclusive to the PlayStation. From its earliest teasers to that trippy arm-in-arm remix, it looked like a technical masterpiece, and a massive step up from the renderware murk of the last generation. This was the opposite end of the graphical S-curve, and this Liberty City felt more real than ever. I picked the game up on launch day with the massive strategy guide they wrote for it for one huge reason. 4 cast a spell on me, something that still tickles my bones when I think back on it. It really was this quantum leap forward in the possibility of open world action games. Sure, we already had Assassin's Creed by then, but this was a whole other level. You could do so much, it was so realistic, and it was gorgeous. Plus it had multiplayer for the first time ever, and it was freaking amazing. 4 was also a miserable sack of a game. Once you got over the technical prowess, the new setting, the graphics, you were left with its miserable coffee-stained visuals, its miserable story, its miserable characters. Playing it wasn't as clunky as the lock-on nonsense of the earlier primordial 3D games, but it found new ways to mimic reality in the most uninteresting ways possible. Maintaining relationships? Going on dates? What? The cars you stole drove like boats, handling as though they were held down by 20,000 pounds of lead sewn into the floorboards. You played Niko Bellic, a war criminal from the Balkans that the game prevents you from enjoying at every possible moment. The cutscenes drag on endlessly, illuminating this horrifying dream of America your cousin lied to you about, and dear Jesus, do I not ever want to play a full game of bowling. Playing it in its prime still felt like drinking day-old coffee in the prettiest pot you'd ever seen. And yet, it's admirable in just how drastic of a misfire it was. I know some people really enjoyed it and put tens or hundreds of hours into that multiplayer and enjoyed the expansions, but it's clear from subsequent games in the series that Rockstar recognized how far out of bounds they'd strayed. That the spell wore off precisely when and how it did probably worked out because it was during a dreadful time in my own life. My girlfriend at the time had just dumped me. I know, sad story. We were a Christian couple, and God had told her through prayer that she was destined to be single forever. In retrospect, as much as that hurt, as entwined as that hurt was with this game, it really does feel like I dodged a romantic bullet because she truly believed that presidential hopeful Barack Obama was the Antichrist. Before we reintroduce the main event here, I have to cast your gaze onto my previous favorite game in the series. It introduced so many cool new mechanics, released on a really popular platform, and has been largely forgotten by fans of the series, it seems. Yeah, I'm talking about 2009's Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars, a game that debuted on the Nintendo DS before being ported to the big mobile platforms. It was pitched as this kind of thin promise from Nintendo that mature games could indeed exist on the DS, but it was also a solid game all its own. Sadly, anytime I bring it up with friends, I typically always get a confused look in return. The story sucks for a variety of reasons we're going to get into later because its flaws thread through the entire series. Chinatown Wars also kills the most interesting character in the second mission, although I think they bring her back toward the end of the game just to kill her again? I don't remember, that's not the point. You're not really here for the story. The game struck an incredible chord with its mix of 2D gameplay and 3D presentation. You played from a pulled-out quasi three-quarter view that established a neat sense of scale with a stylized Liberty City that felt organic despite being almost entirely grid-based. Most importantly, the game took advantage of the DS's secondary touchscreen, opening up all kinds of new interactions and minigames that really got you invested in playing the game without ever feeling like a gimmick. It even has street alignment like GTA 2 did, as a neat little quality of life thing to make driving easier to play on a handheld. This game also made losing the police the most fun in the series by allowing you to easily ram cop cars off the road or into structures. Chinatown Wars also featured a unique drug wars metagame that allowed you to unlock dealers across town and trade different kinds of drugs between them at varying market rates to make money. All the while, you need to watch your behavior in transit, or what might be an awesome payout might just end up being nabbed entirely by the police. Chinatown Wars set the bar really high for Grand Theft Auto games, so 5 really needed to jump pretty high to eclipse my expectations. In my mind, Rockstar's introduction of Grand Theft Auto 5 to the world mirrored how it unveiled GTA 4. Splashy trailers, improved graphics, a hip soundtrack, boundless enthusiasm, a frenetic multiplayer mode, and lots of cinematic influence. You now had 3 playable protagonists instead of the usual lone wolf. After my dreary time with 4, seeing the vibrant, high-energy tones of 5 got me excited about a mainline Grand Theft Auto again. Grand Theft Auto Online was a far more ambitious, and more importantly, persistent game that would carry Grand Theft Auto into the future. And then of course they would have single-player expansions like The Lost and the Damned, and The Ballad of Gay Tony for 5, just like they did for 4, right? Right? In the waning days of our entertainment opinion website, Flesh Eating Zipper, Rockstar sent us 3 freaking copies of the game. Or maybe it was 2 and the other was a pre-order. But we got tons of swag, like this bullet-shaped whistle and this gold ingot thumb drive and these cool stickers. Needless to say, I played, and then we played a lot of Grand Theft Auto 5. It still holds my personal record for the longest consecutive amount of time I've ever played a game at 14 hours straight. In those first couple months, I put 50 hours into the game single player and another 50 into its very early online mode before I think I just burned out. I enjoyed the game so much. And then the next year I played Watch Dogs and started making videos for some obscure YouTube channel. And while Grand Theft Auto Online has grown and evolved, I wasn't along for the ride. So coming back to Grand Theft Auto 5 after all these years with new eyes and putting in another 50 additional hours into the game has been a very interesting experience. For Grand Theft Auto 5, the bulk of this review is going to divide the game into 3 major sections before we get into some other big brain topics and ideas. Chapters 2 and 3 are going to tackle what I truly believe are the Rockstar North / Leslie Benzies portions of the game, the technology that makes the game possible, and the setting they built for it. In Chapter 4, we're going to dive into the Hauser Brothers stuff, the Rockstar North / London story stuff. These are the characters and plots and missions and philosophy that serve as the frosting on the cake, the motivating facade that keeps you coming back to the game and makes it more than just a violent playground. So let's start with the nuts and bolts that get this engine going.
Let's see what we got here. Huh?
Real professional.
Let's do this.
Watching NoClip's documentary on the early days of DMA design, I had flashbacks to my own research into Looking Glass, the guys behind Thief, System Shock, and the immersive sim as a genre, who were legendary tinkerers. Both of these studios were staffed by some incredible technical minds, but in the end it was DMA that lived, largely on the back of their Lemmings puzzle series. Through a series of transactions, DMA came under Take-Two and was rebranded as Rockstar under the reclusive leadership of Sam and Dan Hauser. Sam settled into a top-level executive producer role, while Dan moved up from QA into leading the writing teams that gave the games their signature sardonic edge. And bear in mind, not just Grand Theft Auto, the Red Dead Redemption series, Max Payne 3, Bully, Smuggler's Run, on and on. Again, while Grand Theft Auto 4 and 5 released on the same console hardware, it's pretty mind-blowing how much more the latter was able to achieve technically and graphically. The gulf between them in genuine capability is absolutely nuts. On top of that, GTA 5 has to handle the vast amount of content they've tossed into this digital footprint, a sum that's far greater than any previous game. It does all of this flame juggling with the only seams being the lengthy initial loads, although time has been kind. When your team is staffed with brilliant engineers and programmers supervising an explosion of computational gaming power over 15 years, there's really only one unifying trajectory that Rockstar felt they could get behind: realism. From the earliest cartoony crime games to getting that golf swing just right, Rockstar has made enhancing the realism of its games a top priority. It's not just that Rockstar wants you to steal cars and have sex with women and commit crimes, it's that with each iteration of the series, they put forth a considerable effort toward making the virtual place you do it in something that resembles the real world more and more. This becomes a major tool of its brand of escapism. One of the first ways you'll notice this is in how the characters move, courtesy of the game's implementation of natural motion's Euphoria technology. The way games have traditionally handled animations, most notably in characters, is by having different animations for walking, standing, fighting, and whatever. The older the game, the more easily you see the lack of transition between these phases. Over the years, developers have gotten better at masking these with elements like ragdoll physics, but Euphoria allows GTA 5 to generate animations procedurally based on those various states and existing animations. Long story short, it allows you to move characters realistically. When you push down the stick, they don't immediately leap into a full sprint, they wind up to it, like people do. Characters lean into turns. They dynamically open doors on cars without needing to animate how the character does it for each individual car regardless of height or which side of the car they get into. They push doors open as they approach them. It gives the characters a virtual weight that makes them believable. GTA 5 wasn't the first Grand Theft Auto or Rockstar game to implement natural motion system. Their pilot program for Euphoria, as well as their new in-house Rage engine, was Rockstar's table tennis. Oh, and hey, this is the moment where you probably realize that Rockstar made a table tennis game. It was a real thing. I remember stocking it on shelves. A year and a half later, it was implemented in Grand Theft Auto 4, which was one of many amazing technical tricks that game pulled off. It's still relatively limited compared to what they accomplish in 5, but that's what 5 years and millions of dollars will do. Euphoria isn't perfect, of course. Characters will still slide into place a little here and there. When the game systems don't quite work, like when melee combat fails to connect your character with an enemy, Euphoria will awkwardly try to make it not look like a mess. Where Euphoria also works incredibly well is in how it ties into the game's elaborate physics engine, which is absolutely incredible, except when, you know. The physics here put weight into cars and their crashes. It makes driving them feel weighty and precise. It allows shot characters to fall over ledges. Where GTA 4's physics felt uncalibrated, either making things too heavy or too light, in 5 things feel zeroed in. One of my favorite GTA 5 parlor tricks, however, is one they implemented well in Max Payne 3 the year before, and that is the camera and scripting system that allows the player's view to transition seamlessly from narrative cutscene to gameplay. There are no fades into heads or cutaways. The camera moves into the default third-person position behind the character, and the UI just pops on the screen. Sometimes, if you're not paying enough attention, you may not even notice that you can start interacting with your character. This would be a knock in another game, but here is just a result of the game's magic. Each and every single time the game pulls this off, I silently squeak to myself. I fall for it over and over, and I love it. Thankfully, the game shows restraint in not employing it in gimmicky ways, because when you see the camera zoom in while Franklin repos Jimmy's truck, revealing Michael hiding in the rear seat, you kind of want to see that happen over and over. Instead, Rockstar holds back. Of course, you can't have 3 playable protagonists unless you have a mechanic to switch between them. How easy it would have been to lock into each character individually for a mission, then use a simple transition to hop into the shoes of the next one. But Rockstar North thinks so much bigger. Holding down on the D-pad and then flicking the right stick in a direction will switch you between the game's characters with a fancy transition. Sometimes this is with them in the same room in real time. Sometimes it pops you out to a satellite view before swishing you over to wherever the game planted that other character. They'll have some clever bit ready when you land too, something that felt similar to the various resurrection animations from Sunset Overdrive the following year. Within the story, switching between these characters, Franklin, Michael, and Trevor, makes things far more interesting. And the game doesn't force your hand outside of boot up or its missions. You can run around San Andreas as any of them at any time. Almost. This allows the narrative to build stories for each character that then makes toggling between them a voluntary and even independent choice until you want to push the story along. You may enjoy hunting with Trevor and then casually wonder, like a glance to a notification shade, what you could be doing as Franklin. And boom, just like that, you're skipping around town and doing Franklin stuff. Within each mission, you'll switch between characters as the action unfurls. This allows you to experience these multi-layered, complex tasks from multiple perspectives, accomplishing different things. The missions themselves will hinge on this mechanic to such an extent that it's mandatory, but unfortunately, they also tend to be so overly scripted that the game practically grabs your hand to use it. It makes for some interesting cinematic moments, but it does awkwardly feel like you're being robbed of your agency, which then doubly makes the missions feel like more constrictive experiences when you're failed for arbitrary reasons. It seems the only restraining factor to the mechanic's usage is how specifically Rockstar built these missions where characters are only useful for very specific moments. GTA Online, in my very early time with it, felt like something toward that with its cooperative quests, but not quite. I gave up on it long before they implemented the much requested heists, the biggest task that people loudly wanted from launch, so I can't speak to how much better or differently that worked out. But what good would a realistic virtual world be unless you also modeled its mundanity? You know, a little bit of chaff to go along with all that juicy, juicy wheat. You may have issues with bright HUD indicators telling you precisely where to go, or fast travel that renders vast role-playing game worlds into vast skippable regions, and Rockstar kinda agrees. The only issue is that their solution is just weird. Take the golf game. Yes, Grand Theft Auto 5 has a 19-hole golf course and a very well executed golf game to boot. With each swing of the club and landing of your ball, you kinda expect it to automatically shuttle your character to deal the next, ball striking. But it doesn't. It's opt-in. You gotta tap a shoulder button. So by proxy, every time your ball lands, the game wants you to walk your character over to it before it snaps back into golf mode. I mean, the real world doesn't have a shoulder button. Why should you? Putting an emphasis on the beauty and detail and expansiveness of the San Andreas they built and the driving model they put together, you have to drive to each and every location they ask you to go. Each and every time. No shoulder button here, although technically you don't need to use a vehicle, but it would take substantially longer otherwise. The game even banks on this. When you're on mission as a moment to build characters and relationships, or resolve tension, or build tension. There are a lot of incredibly long drives in this game. I didn't literally count out how long you're commuting in this game, but it's safe to say it's a non-trivial amount. It may in fact be excessive at times. But I mean, thank goodness gracious that the game looks pretty, or that San Andreas is a very interesting place to be, or that the driving model is actually fun. There's really dumb stuff in here, like the fact that they built an entire mopping minigame for one of the heists that's calibrated in such a way that you have to drench your mop in the provided bucket. Twice. I mean, that's pretty dumb, but probably the dumbest, most mundane thing the game does is give Franklin a new house. On its face, that sounds like a silly complaint. As the game opens, we see that Franklin lives with his aunt just beyond the freeway from downtown Los Santos. It's a comfy, homey space. As Franklin gets more involved with his crime partners, their criminal nerd mastermind Lester decides to buy the house as part of some elaborate financial transactions, and it becomes Franklin's. And I mean, it's a pretty house. It's got cool art, and it's got a great view. Yeah, lots of cool big windows. But then what? You see, the functionality of this big house is identical to your aunt's house. You can still get kinda drunk, you can still change your clothes, you can still only have a one-car garage, and then everything else is just show. You can't do anything with this space. You can't throw parties, there are no extra things to boost skills or arcade cabinets to bury yourself in. It's just prettier. More importantly, it's annoying as shit. It's up the hills of Bel Air and only accessible by a series of switchbacking roads. It's actually a downgrade compared to the convenience of being on a depressed street next to downtown, because your fortress isn't next to anything. Considering how many times you have to snake up and down from your opulent fucking ivory tower, I would have paid virtual cash for a house that wasn't so inconvenient. The only other rational reason the game gives to justify the move is extrinsic. Lester teases that it's leverage to use Franklin to pull off more of his assassination missions. Franklin's friends call it a wedge between him and them and how much he's changed as he becomes more financially successful through the game. Ironically, his most vocal critic in that regard, his ex-girlfriend Tanisha, stopped dropping by the old neighborhood a long time ago anyway, according to Lamar. Trust me, I've got 10,068 words about the story later on. Despite being a game and a franchise based on stealing cars, shooting people, and committing crimes, none of that ever really felt very good before this game. I mean, they tried. They really did. But the step up to 2 was a step back in a lot of ways, and with 4, it felt like no matter what Rockstar wanted to accomplish, they would ultimately get in their own way. But not with 5. Here you get intuitive stuff like left trigger, right trigger shooty action. You get an experience that makes its longer commutes and larger shootouts enjoyable at the worst. These are the core gameplay loops, those 30 seconds of fun over and over, that Rockstar had simply failed to make just right. But not with 5. I stuck with the controller for this version yet again for one reason: driving. I don't care how precise that mouse cursor is for making people dead, I get my driving done with a left stick and 2 triggers, thank you very much. The game introduces it quite strangely with the cars that Franklin Lamar repo. No, I'm not counting that straight road with the truck in the prologue, because they don't handle like a lot of other vehicles. In fact, they're cars most susceptible to the yawing camera mechanic, in which the car looks like it's pivoting on a single center point. It makes driving from the third person possible, but also visually strange. Once you get used to it, however, it's the best driving has ever been in the Grand Theft Auto. This is the first game, well, maybe the second after GTA 4, where driving from the third person felt acceptable. Forza Horizon 2 also opened with you screeching down public roads in supercars, but it had the bumper cam view that I strongly prefer for racing games. This game doesn't. Paired with the game's effective physics modeling, racing through town or up the highway through traffic, or away from cops or against other street racers, is nearly always an exciting lean-forward experience. The kind that makes you want to turn down the radio so you can think clearly. Coordinating with the physics also makes maneuvers like handling semi-trucks and their trailers a treat, especially as you learn how to jackknife very quickly. Since these are unlicensed fictitious cars, the game can get away with some pretty incredible damage modeling. Corners get dinged up, hoods fly off, but sometimes it just looks like the game distorted a mesh, and it looks like video game happened to the car. Unlike the older games, however, I only once ever damaged a car to flames, which inevitably causes it to blow up. These cars are really resilient to crashes and gunfire, whereas in older games they fell apart pretty easily, creating grisly explosive scenes of violence. The game also doesn't want you to end up on your hood, a situation that would also cause it to catch fire and explode. So it lets you help it back onto its paws with the joystick to somewhat comical effect. Of course, what good is driving places if you can't also partake in combat as you do it? The game provides, even mandates, the need to discharge firearms into other moving vehicles from your own moving vehicles. But this is no Interstate 76 with its fixed gun placements. It's actually quite difficult to pull off, a bit of rubbing belly, patting head situation. I realized that there are alternate control schemes, but I eventually got used to it. Fun fact, firing from a moving vehicle is even more difficult when you aren't the one driving as well. And then there's the actual Grand Theft Auto, the car stealing. The act is relatively simple. If the vehicle is manned, you simply press a button to unman or unwoman it in a fun little ceremony provided by Euphoria. As the series has grown, the titular act feels less and less significant for reasons we'll dive into later with thousands of other words. But mechanically, I kinda wish there was more to it. If the car is unmanned, there is some dice roll to determine if you trip a car alarm when you break in. Strangely, even in those situations, I rarely summoned a single star rating or notice by the police. I'm also bummed that they didn't bother to include any kind of hot wiring minigame like Chinatown Wars had. Again, I know on its surface it looks just like a gimmick to take advantage of the DS's touchscreen, but in practice it was a super fun and suspenseful way to jack a car. Heck, even GTA 4 required you to hotwire a car from time to time, so the fact that they streamlined it out entirely for 5 feels like a whiff. Racing in GTA 5 with cars anyway can be difficult. I owned Midnight Club Los Angeles, Rockstar's last standalone racing game from what used to be Angel Studios, the guys who made the first couple of Midtown Madness games for Microsoft. Angel Studios was purchased by Rockstar and rebranded Rockstar San Diego, which also developed the Rage engine used here. I played Midnight Club LA for maybe an hour or two before it wound up in a drawer, inevitably traded into GameStop. It felt soulless and uninteresting despite the Rockstar polish. Racing in GTA 5 sure reminded me of that game. Yes, I owned Burnout Paradise. No, I didn't like it. Don't at me, bro. While Forza was implementing the extremely helpful rewind feature, GTA 5 was still being a bit hardcore. I mean, yes, it would have been a task to implement an entire rewind system for this one series of events, but I tell you what, falling from first place to last because of an errant car or light pole was some real unforgivable blue shell energy. While it's not exclusive to the street races, it is kind of fun to have your character rant and groan at your screw-ups as though they're repeating your frustration.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
There are plenty of other land races that don't involve dancing with traffic, but if you really just want some easy wins, hop on a jet ski, because once you get past the initial rush, plowing through empty rolling ocean is pretty easy. Flying though, that's a beast all its own thanks to the third dimension and some hella wind modeling. Helicopters come with their own challenging physics model too, so you have to get used to diving to accelerate while balancing it out with lifting force to ensure you don't end up splashing into the concrete jungle. The game offers an elaborate training school to learn how to fly planes and helicopters effectively, but it strangely only offers this after it's tool-tipped you into learning it beforehand. Getting the hang of flying takes some effort without the atmosphere pushing you around like a dull bully. Learning to take off, fly through hoops, and complete objectives are increasingly difficult, but when you can pull off a landing? Oh man, that's an achievement. Just don't try doing it on urban straightaways, because it will probably not work out. Even better is stealing a 747 from the airport and landing it at the tiny dirt field in the Alamo Sea. I've done it! Oh, and don't forget that if you need to take to the skies for any random reason and haven't purchased any means to do so yourself, you can just call in a blimp to pilot. Yes, an honest-to-goodness gracious blimp. Of course, there's combat. In a major step up for the series, similar to Fallout 4's massive improvements over previous games, the gunplay in Grand Theft Auto 5 is freaking sick. Finally. Shooting people in this game requires precision and lethality, making the violence feel incisive and surgical, the antithesis of the big bullets and explosive chaos of the older games, to the extent that you won't feel the itch to murder or blow things up as often here. Yes, you can still buy rockets and grenades, but they've never felt more out of place than they do here. This makes each shot feel like a specifically considered act, and you're given a visual reminder of this when the screen flashes monochrome with each kill. Combat also builds on the cover system for GTA 4, and it works well for the most part, keeping you out of fire, but your enemies can utilize it as well. I think I'm getting tired of waiting for police officers, gangsters, corrupt government officials, and security guards to pop out of cover in timed intervals to shoot at, but that's not a problem specific to this game. Cover in GTA 5 can be finicky though. There's no blind firing, and toggling the cover button on far too many occasions sent my character hurtling toward a point on the opposite wall instead of planting me against the wall I was standing next to. The system is also inflexible in that there's no mechanism to get you around a corner like there was in the Deus Ex prequel Human Revolution 2 years prior, or Gears of War half a decade before that. If enemies are flanking you, you have to pop out of cover, move, then pop back in. It's not the biggest deal, but it really does make the mechanic feel pretty light considering its predecessors. There's hand-to-hand melee combat, and when you can connect with enemies, it feels visceral. You can't quite compete with the Assassin's Creed / Batman style systems of the era, but it's still better than what the series had previously offered. Ammunition becomes a more important fixture than ever in a GTA game, because it's where you arm up with all the latest and greatest weaponry, armor, and even outfits. It's a deluxe store as is, but some even have firing ranges to boost your character skills. Not only can you load up with more ammo than you'll ever need, you'll be able to augment and customize your weaponry for a pretty penny as well. In the field, the weapon wheel does its best to keep things in order, even as each slot eventually serves multiple weapons. And then, yes, you buy armor, which serves as an extra bank of depletable health. Your health replenishes up to halfway anyway, but I never really felt I got my money's worth. 5's combat system combined with its intricate environments makes shootouts feel really good, especially the larger ones. It also gets put to the test during rampages and police shootouts, which are standards of the series, all of which we'll circle back to. One last thing before we move on, your characters take very specific damage during firefights. I should say they acquire bloody decals that look like injury. It really makes your characters look fucked up after an intense exchange of lead, but the streaks and bloody pancakes that get painted on during a fight don't then communicate any kind of underlying trouble or injury, so you'll run around or enter cutscenes with these really nasty looking wounds bleeding through clothing, and no one seems to notice, not even the character. It's interesting. It's also meant that my deaths usually came by surprise because the characters don't telegraph how badly they're doing until it's too late. And then there's one of the game's many small and definitely underutilized tools, stealth. The notion that you would ever play GTA in a way that minimizes your detectability seems really silly in the context of the older games, but as the series' violence has become smaller and more precise, throwing in stealth makes more sense. To enter stealth, you click in the left stick and you're suddenly emitting less sound and drawing less attention from nearby enemies. Obviously, it doesn't make much sense to use this in a lot of the big, wide game, so it often becomes something the game begs you to toggle in highly scripted missions. If the game had open world fixtures like strongholds and outposts, or even situations where you could steal stuff without excessive force, it would make sense to use this on a regular basis, but it doesn't. But what good is technology without an amazing setting to demonstrate it? Here, Grand Theft Auto V does not let down.
Hi there. Meow. I'm Kirby, the official mascot of the Nth Review. How are you? I hope you're enjoying the videos so far. I'm sneaking in here between chapters because, as a feline who's very interested in what my dad is up to, I've noticed that the channel has exploded in popularity since the last big review. So, first off, thank you for checking out this one. They take a long time to make, so when people find them and watch them and think they're pretty swell, that makes my dad really happy and it warms my furry heart too. Not only were you guys hungry for System Shock content like I am for food all the damn time, you also went through all the review's old content that had been collecting dust and watched that too. That's great. Because of all you new viewers, Dad also started getting requests for new reviews. I know some were already on his list, but there were plenty of new ones, and he'd love to make more of the reviews that you want to see. Unfortunately, that's kind of difficult when he works 2 other jobs and has to leave me here at home, warm and extremely comfortable. He'd love to do a review on the 2 Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic games, the 5 Bungie Halo games, the 343 Halo games, the Mass Effect trilogy, the 5 Quantic Dream games, Borderlands, the Horizon games, on and on. But even the smallest of those projects will take nearly half a year to do with all the other stuff he's been doing, and he really doesn't want to put more than 4 months between reviews ever again, even if it does turn out as a 5-hour video. On top of that, there are other gaming projects and labors of love he'd love to do that aren't strictly review content. It's kind of a big dream for a channel this size, but Dad spent a lot of time dreaming about it. If any of that sounds interesting, the best way to make it happen, beyond watching this video to the very last second, liking, subscribing, and sharing it with every other fan of long-form gaming reviews you know, is to support the channel through the Nth Review Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can support the channel and get access to special Discord stuff and the monthly Q&A. For as little as $5 a month, you can get your name in the credits, you can pitch questions during the monthly Q&As, and so much more. There's a whole website about it. It's called patreon.com/the Nth Review. With your patronage, there's a whole hell of a lot more my dad can do on this channel. Oh, hey meow, what's that address again? Why, it's patreon.com/the Nth Review. That's right, patreon.com/the Nth Review. Patreon.com/the Nth Review. Meow, go check it out.
Everything in its time, all right. Gentlemen, please, come check out the storage facilities. Go on now. Nice, right? There you go. Ample room inside. Mr. Cheng, please, sir, if you will. Let me out. Tour will recommence shortly, gentlemen.
When it comes to Rockstar Productions, it's clear that how it looks and how it sounds is critical. If their newest game can't utilize the latest and greatest technology with an army of artists and technicians to fill it, how can their handcrafted narratives possibly survive in an interactive digital space? It goes without saying, although I'm gonna say it anyway, that Grand Theft Auto V was an absolute marvel when it released, and it still slaps today. To that end, you'll be immediately impressed by the visuals. It looks amazing, and yes, granted, this is the 2015 update, but 7 years later, still. Even if you aren't running the game in 4K, the spectacle is still there, from the beautiful sunrises and sunsets, the detailed models, all those Euphoria-powered animations, the well-modeled cars, the detail and decorum of interior scenes, and far more. Everything feels crafted and thought of. There are lots of beautiful scenes and effects on display here, like the variety of cool atmospheric conditions, haze, fog, god rays, on and on. Compared to GTA 4, 5 uses color more effectively without being nuts about it. It's no System Shock or Saints Row, but it makes the game look vibrant, even optimistic. It adds to the realism. There are even working mirrors in this game, and I thought those were dead. One visual drawback I noticed in the middle and long distance is texture tiling, and while it just looks off-putting when it happens in the hillsides, it looks especially strange on paved roads. The game's cutscenes, which are plentiful and inserted into nearly every single mode and mission you play, are typically well composed and the acting is solid and believable. But it becomes clear pretty quickly that they do all feel like actors in mocap suits performing within a 30 by 30 foot space with some props while a virtual Steadicam frames the action. These are good character models too, but the facial animations are kinda lacking. Characters tend to have 4 or 5 expressions that they animate between while chatting, and when everything else in this game looks so damn good, their molded facades really felt like a weak point. This is punctuated further by the fact that GTA 5 released 2 years after Rockstar published LA Noire, an open-world detective story that featured high-resolution facial capture for its characters that's equal parts incredible and surreal. I'm not saying GTA 5 needed that kind of fidelity, but something a little more expressive and dynamic would have made them stand up to the caliber of the rest of the game. The game is happily contemporary for 2013, which made it very easy for it to embrace its own famous brand of satirical reality. There are lots of ads in this world with franchise favorite parodies like Pisswasser beer because, you know, it's German beer that tastes like human urine. Get it? The Hauser's one-note shtick is something we'll survey considerably in Chapter 4. While there's a valid function avoiding real brands in these games, where it gets particularly annoying is when it comes to the game's cars, which are clearly mimics of recognizable vehicles from the real world. For the sake of mechanics, you have to abide by whatever awful fake name they gave it that doesn't even correlate with what it actually is. Look, it's a Charger, it's a Pacer, it's an Audi, it's a Rolls Royce, it's a Beetle, it's a Zonda, it's a Lotus, it's an El Camino, it's a Koenigsegg, it's a Viper, it's a Hummer, on and on. Memorizing these fake names wouldn't normally be an issue, but when your vehicles routinely wind up in the LSPD impound lot, are you going to remember what the hell a Buffalo or a Super Diamond or an FQ2 is? No, of course not. Why should you? These are awful, stupid names. On the plus side, the game's interface and graphic design is world freaking class. Holy cow, is it a relief how great this game's tools are. It's easy to move around this game and get things done, whether it's buying weapons, switching radio stations, switching characters, getting a bead on skill upgrades, and so on. I'm not the biggest fan of the scripty Marguerite for names and subheaders because it's typically shrunken down into corners, which makes it harder to read. An incredible example of the game's design chops is the map, which you'll use plenty often. It fogs out everywhere you haven't been, unless your machine is suffering from memory issues and it takes a second for it to pop in, and the look is extremely clean and vectorized. It rarely let me down, and honestly, just looking over it was a treat to itself. For the 2015 next-gen update, Rockstar added a first-person mode to the game, which from time to time provides some extra cool context to animations they'd made originally that had gone completely unnoticed from a distant third-person camera. That said, I don't like it. It suffers from the same wobbly implementation that Thief Deadly Shadows had, something I explore in my big ol' Thief series review that you should check out, in which the game was clearly designed and built for third-person action, but then they just stapled a camera to the 3D model, called it first person, and that was the end of it. On foot, first person feels just absolutely alien, like you're controlling a tank. In cars, it feels like you're in a giant egg and makes driving feel strange as well. No sir, I do not like it. Also, it's not entirely the game's fault. I experienced some incredible hitching in my performance here despite this machine being relatively robust when the game released. GTA 5 is constantly doing stuff with RAM and tossing massive amounts of data in and out, so between the game doing that, me recording the footage, and some other stupid crap I had going on in the background, the game on PC regularly ran into fits, especially as I came into downtown Los Santos. Even if the original Xbox 360 version I played nearly a decade ago wasn't running in this fidelity and it had some hella load times all its own, I don't remember a performance hitching like this. And yes, this happened while installed to an SSD, so there's no need to try and troubleshoot it from the comments section. I gradually increased my performance over the course of the game, so I'm not knocking the game for it. It's just something I had to regularly experience and then edit out of the footage for this video. The audio experience here in San Andreas is also world class, but would we expect any less from a Rockstar release? I'd honestly have something to say about so much of the sound design and Foley work and dynamics if they'd screwed up, but it's incredible at all times to listen to. Whether it's the combat, the voice acting, the subtle environmental effects, they nail it. Instead, I want to lean on the music and score. Grand Theft Auto V features a lot of music and a lot of score. For the pivotal moments of the game, Rockstar recruited German electronic pioneers Tangerine Dream to provide the tense, synthy soundtrack that really puts players on edge. I actually don't have a lot of context for them as a band, except that one of their earlier members, Christopher Frank, did the score for Babylon 5, the prolific sci-fi series that's shaped so much of modern serialized TV. Hearing the score here actually reminded me a lot of Jan Hammer's work for Miami Vice, or the early computer animation festivals I watched as a kid. Playing the game, I remember it was there. I remember my anxiety ramping, but it's very understated. Going back to my footage, it barely registers at times, and I wish I'd had the insight to raise the music level because it does truly elevate the action. There's a lot of synthy, non-Tangerine Dream music and even non-electronic score in here as well, but I think the most memorable is the loop that comes up during triathlons. Its machine-like crescendos work perfectly when you're just cranking away on that A button to build or keep your lead. And then of course you have the licensed music that forms the game's many radio stations. To be honest, I have some very specific tastes in music, and licensed soundtracks tend not to do much for me. I can count on one hand the number of games I've really glommed onto the soundtrack, and it's like Jet Set Radio Future and Project Gotham Racing, the first one, and I mean, it's not to say that licensed soundtracks are terrible or something, although Watch Dogs absolutely was. It's just that most of it's not for me. GTA 5 kind of falls in line with that, but Radio Mirror Park, much like Radio Broker and 4, became a favorite, and the game turned me on to The Chain Gang of 1974 and Battle Tapes. Looking back, it's interesting to see how much Good Kid, Mad City era Kendrick Lamar and pre-Atrocity Exhibition Danny Brown are in here. But there are a few things wrong with this setup. First off, the game doesn't seem to give a shit about your musical preferences. Each vehicle has a default radio station that it plays when you hop in, even if it's the character's personal vehicle. You can't set a default radio station when you enter into a car, so if you have a preference that isn't the default, you have to switch it each time. This is true even if you set your radio station, leave the vehicle, enter a cutscene or other story-based interruption, and then come back to the exact same vehicle. It'll just revert to whatever the vehicle's default. This isn't the only simple thing that I wish the game remembered, but there seems to be an urge to make the game's massive variety of music, a list that takes up a sizable chunk of the ending credits, discoverable. Like, hey, be subjected to these random radio stations and be exposed to music you don't traditionally listen to. Maybe you'll fall in love with it. No. Pandora, this is not. I think the game segregating music into genre stations really hurts the discoverability in a huge way, but that's the tip of the iceberg. There's no way to build virtual playlists here. The licensed music exists entirely within their genre radio silos in a linear format with bumpers and everything. Your only choice for musical preference is to choose a preferred station, and then, again, the game is constantly resetting whatever you chose. It makes me wonder, as Giant Bomb's Jeff Gershman has, how do you even pull off licensed music in GTA 6 in a world of non-linear on-demand streaming? Is the old-school terrestrial radio station approach still gonna work? Do 24-hour talk radio stations even make sense anymore? Are they gonna have podcasts? Do they even need snarky DJs between tracks? Who knows? San Andreas is a massive world. The largest that Rockstar had made to date, larger than pretty much all of their previous 3D worlds combined. Of course, they top it in 2018 with their map for Red Dead Redemption 2, although this is the part of the review where I mentioned that I haven't played either of those games because they're just not my bag. San Andreas is beautiful, but it also feels like a real place, a place you can just disappear into. But that's not something unique to GTA 5. I remember being immersed in the worlds of Halo, Morrowind, Anime Tokyo, or even GTA 3's Liberty City over a decade prior. But this San Andreas still holds up, whereas those others, coming out when they did, have their technical limitations. This virtual world feels alive and dynamic with all of the technical and presentation effects I mentioned earlier, but then there are animals hopping around, and there's realistic attention paid to urban planning. There are people walking around having real phone conversations that someone had to script. There are memorials to the dead. This world feels organic, authentic. GTA 5's map, like previous games, is an island separated from some fictional mainland, something convenient for world design and never addressed within the game's fiction. Not that we care. There were plenty of times replaying this nearly decade-old game where I got vibes of deja vu, points where my brain was fully immersed in buying what Rockstar put together. Driving into Los Santos from the high desert put me right back in the East Valley of Los Angeles that first year we went to E3, coming in from Barstow. Or there's the time you roll up to Michael's house with Franklin after a night out shooting up mafia goons right as the sun is beginning to rise. Or heck, just cruising around on these streets while the saxophone from Jerry Rafferty's Baker Street blares. All of these things and more just brought me back to places and experiences that are sewn into my memory. There are some niggles from here to there that do the opposite and pull me out of the experience though, like the complete lack of stop signs or four-way stops. And then there are roads that tee directly into the freeway in the country, which is pretty ridiculous. San Andreas is a big egg-shaped mass that's divided into thirds. The bottom third is Los Santos, a faux creation of Los Angeles, while the top 2/3 emulates the north and east valleys of the Los Angelino deserts with the Alamo Sea and Mount Chiliad. I've been to LA 5 times, and this reminds me a whole lot of those. Dan Houser told The Guardian that they spent an extensive amount of time researching the area, taking photographs and creating references for the game. The only thing that I truly missed here, something that I know was in GTA San Andreas a decade earlier, is the Los Angeles Convention Center where E3 takes place. I just think it's neat, and I missed it here. The city is extremely detailed, riddled with tiny assets and alleys and backways to explore. These nooks and crannies provide amazing experiences to retreat when you're trying to hide out from the police, which is probably the most intense the game gets. It's cool to see different cars, even different people of different races populating the city's different neighborhoods without calling attention to themselves, like big industrial trucks in industrial zones or classic cars in poorer neighborhoods. Highlights for me included pulling off an assassination at a recreation of the Beverly Hilton, the hotel we stayed at in 2009 for our Infinite Lives documentary. At a point, you recover Michael's daughter, Tracy, from a yacht that's imported directly from Max Payne 3. I mean, it's a cool yacht. Wander beyond the city and you get into the world's countryside, a desert town framed by temperate mountainous wilderness. In previous games, this area would be progress gated, but here the game kinda ignores it, casually dropping a few random events up here through side quests until the game brings Trevor into the storyline. These non-urban biomes, which are actual biomes, invite exploration and relaxation without much in the way of traffic or the usual noise that Los Santos brings. By the Alamo Sea are rows of sun-baked dried-out trailers, a decaying strip mall, and random stores that really just gave me vibes of when I lived in Phoenix. There's a big box store out here, the trademark anchor of American suburbia, but I kind of wish it was more gross, with a parking lot that is way too damn large and lots more shopping carts to mess around with. There's an expansive military base out here as well. At first, you need to fly low to avoid it during Trevor's first flights, and there's a side mission that sends you there, but it's really a treasure chest of rare, heavily armed vehicles that is extremely difficult to get into. The game is contemporary to when it came out, and while that might not seem like a big deal considering it was just 2013, there are some interesting cultural and technological changes that could make a GTA 6 a fundamentally different game if they implemented them. For some examples, while the Tesla Model S was gaining popularity as a luxury sedan when GTA 5 came out, electric vehicles were still only a blip on the radar in 2013, so there's only a Prius-like in the game that's used in a stunningly brief chase with Laszlo in the main quest. Heck, they even call it a battery car. Similarly, while there are bicycles and motorcycles, there aren't any e-bikes or e-scooters. We've already talked about how music still pipes in over the air, but not through cell phones. In fact, Lester still contacts you via payphones for assassination missions. Are there even payphones around that haven't been ripped out or converted into Wi-Fi hotspots? Were there even any in 2013? You can call for a taxi, those medallioned yellowed cars with the clear flag on top that you could pay to drive you places, although the card machine never worked. But this was moments before gig economy services like Lyft and Uber, or even Instacart gained traction. Heck, just a few months before the game released, I wrote an article about the absurdity of Walmart paying people to deliver your groceries. Like that'll ever happen. The game utilizes a smartphone metaphor to interact with people, but it barely has much more functionality than the feature phone from GTA 4. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but you can't pop open an app and start Ubering people places. You can't be riding over to the in-world Walmart because there aren't any, so you can't move some bananas and energy drinks for some paper. 5 also glosses over the use of GPS, which would make literally anything insanely traceable and be far more useful than the game's sporadic car alarms that police barely respond to anyway. If we stopped here with all the features this game has, with all the technology that makes the game work, with all the world they've built, we'd have a massive playground where we could build so many other kinds of games around, something this game tries to do with its incredible budget. You could easily insert a series like Project Gotham, or Forza Horizon, or Midtown Madness with this setup. You could build entire other games into the game they built for GTA 5. In a video I put together way back in 2020 that, a couple of you watched, I advocated for an expansion pack of just triathlons and marathon events because the triathlons in this game really resonated for me personally. And no, God no, we don't need any more Marianne interludes.
Fuck you!
Why are you so angry?
I'm not angry! I'm exercising!
This is a world apart from the early games where your mission was very simple and the game they built around it was similarly simple. When the series moved to 3D, gaining incredible powers to replicate the real world with each passing generation, the franchise shifted from simply stealing cars and committing crimes to becoming a bit of an everything simulator. Grand Theft Auto 5 offers so many diversions and non-crime opportunities that committing crimes and going on violent rampages feels more optional, more unnecessary, and more contrived as a motivation than ever. To that end, one of my favorite parts of this game philosophically, intentionally or not, is the notion that you aren't hanging out in buildings 90% of the time like we do here in the real world. This tracks with the series' tension to keep swimming or die, that standing still is accomplishing nothing, that there are no safe harbors to take refuge in, that the floor is lava and there is no ottoman to hop onto. This isn't some specific critique of modern society. The game makes one of its painfully and knowingly ironic statements about this in the fact that Michael's son Jimmy, portrayed by the younger Pete, is always in his room playing video games and being a genuinely toxic piece of shit.
He posts this picture of his newborn, and I'm all like, damn son, that right there is one ugly ass motherfucker of a baby.
There are practical reasons why this kind of out and about lifestyle isn't realistic. We have day jobs, we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited energy, we don't have unlimited funds. But something this game does that I don't even think it thinks about is address the modern American castle doctrine that someday we're just gonna all end up living in capsule hotels or self-storage lockers wired up to VR headsets like Snow Crash dreams of, and Mark Zuckerberg just copies. And I'm not talking specifically about the American self-defense castle doctrine, although that does play a part. What I mean is that, and I'm going to speak specifically about America here as an American, we live in a society in which people and institutions and ideas are becoming increasingly distant from each other. We live in castles and use, essentially, massive metal pods to move between them and other fortifications. Through this transaction, we hermetically seal ourselves away from the world and society at large. This allows a paranoia to brew about other people and their motivations. It allows us to embrace and foster false fantasies about society at large. Because we in America have made low-density R1 single-family households a priority in city development, because we have so much empty and undeveloped frontier, because we built or destroyed so many of our cities to appease the automobile, the difference between us and Futurama's vision of being sucked through pneumatic tubes is really only a matter of semantics. I've seen how the American castle doctrine has steered policy and politics. It's made villains out of the less fortunate who exist beyond our threshold. It's made villains out of those struggling with mental health issues or people walking down the streets who look different than us. It's made villains out of policies and goals that exist for the benefit of all, like wearing masks in public places in the midst of a pandemic, or housing first priorities to address homelessness. When we feel comfortable in our own situation, in our own sealed and safe space, especially when we didn't need to be part of the 1% to acquire that security, we begin to judge those who don't have that safety as being moral failures. As time goes on, this polarization has only gotten worse. It's why we've built such a unique culture around firearms that people get so passionate about to protect themselves from the nebulous threats of an unknown outside world. It's why so many people were passionate about a border wall that wouldn't have addressed any of our immigration concerns. People get extremely defensive when others speak in another language, despite multilingualism being common around the world. It's how people embrace nationalism and fascism and wave the flag as though their exclusive class of people who look and act like them is the only true America, and they are the only true Americans, and their patriotism is the only true patriotism. They embrace falsehoods and non-truths because they conform to their worldview, and they lionize the police and military who savage our enemies both here and abroad, whether it's legitimate and lawful or not. Like, when was the last time you walked through your neighborhood? When was the last time you knew someone in your neighborhood? When was the last time one of your neighbors knew you and said hello? When was the last time you entertained the notion of going to a public park at night, something that's still fashionable in Europe? We think stuff like this is perverse because it's different. We refuse to accept the bitter pill that we're in the wrong and that this attitude is unsustainable. We don't view our country as a land of us, but an archipelago of I's, and this type of thinking is cancerous. Grand Theft Auto 5, despite having homes and requiring cars for any kind of effective transportation, is largely the inverse of this, at least if you ignore the conservative talking points that the game presents ironically for cheap laughs. This is a game that needs you to be out and about and engage in a variety of activities in order to progress, or even just play. As I'll elaborate more on in a minute, the game's most effective tool is its go outside and do something mechanic that temporarily seems tone deaf in a world where the COVID pandemic was allowed to rage as it has. This is a Scottish-developed game written by Londoners, and despite their study and obsession with American culture, many gamers probably wouldn't even know that this was a game made in Great Britain. I have plenty of those 10,068 words about the game's story dedicated to the Hausers' treatment of it, but unfortunately, this perspective seemed to slip under their radar. While there are plenty of other open-world games that operate on this very same philosophy, they don't really model the authenticity in the world that GTA 5 is trying to produce here. You're not going to swing between buildings or grapple and parachute your way around town. Those games also aren't trying to comment on American society as strongly as this game does, and I think that's the thin line between them. What won't slip under your radar, however, is the growing sea of icons that appear on your in-game map. You may remember the fun old days of dynamic pointing arrows or the series glyphs on your radar indicating where next missions were, but the series has an obsession with ramping up the number and quality of extracurricular activities with each successive game. There are 4 main categories of missions and activities that the game lays out for you. The first are the main quest missions, those letters on your map and radar that propel the main story. You can ignore these as you see fit, but there's plenty of stuff that doesn't unlock elsewhere or become available for purchase until you defeat its progress locks. The second are the character-specific side missions, the strangers and freaks stuff, that build characters and add flavor. The third are the character-agnostic side missions and activities that consume the most real estate. And then finally there are the collectible hunts, which are definitely not for me. It's this third category I want to focus on right now. There are lots of options across this massive landscape. They thought of almost literally every activity they could have ever wanted to put in a GTA game after GTA 4 was such a noisy slog of a game. This thing is loaded to the gills with absurd potential, like, do you want to play golf? Or tennis? Swim, bike, or run in a triathlon? Ride a Ferris wheel? Are you sure? Want to watch a movie? Or a TV show, or live helicopter footage of you doing something, which is really confusing because it screws with your controls and I don't know why they included it because it sucks. Do you want to do drugs, or do yoga, skydive, ride a cable car to the game's highest point, play with your dog, take pictures of animals for the local tourist board, hunt animals, rob a store if someone's there, get robbed, chase down criminals, steal money from armored trucks, steal cars, although every driver seems completely unconcerned about what you're about to do. There is so much to do! Despite the size of the place, the game doesn't give you quite enough reasons to stop and smell the roses. It's a problem I had with Just Cause 3 in that there is so much to see and do, and the game makes such a big deal out of cramming you into a vehicle to zoom across it as quickly as possible. But as you dive into the weeds and soak in the game's many details, things begin to make less sense. Traffic lights don't quite work. Following a car, like in most any other open world game, reveals the game's simple agent AI, sending cars and people in nonsensical spirals and loops without a destination. Or maybe the AI is incredibly sophisticated, knows you're tailing them, and is just trying to throw you off. Drivers will pull out right in front of you when they clearly don't have the right-of-way or a safe window to transit. Sometimes they'll slam into you at full speed. Other times on foot, they'll just run you over. Buses have no system map or schedule and rarely stop, much less let people on or off. You can't even get on a bus except to hijack it. There are so many places to check out, so many gaps between spaces where you wouldn't think things are happening, and yet they are. There's so much detail in this world, props to investigate, things to look at, storefronts to check out, and you can skip right over it. I wish the game rewarded this kind of pedestrian exploration with something like Crackdown's agility orbs or Forza Horizon's Explore All Roads achievements. As it stands, you won't find a reason to investigate many of these spaces, much less enjoy all the game's verticality, unless you're hiding from a police pursuit. And this is a different complaint than the fact that the game will often drop you off a quarter mile from the nearest vehicle after a mission, or in the middle of nowhere on boot. One is voluntary, and the other isn't. It's disappointing how much game they built for the human scale, and then they rarely incentivize you to take a look. Maybe I need a Red Dead Redemption game for that. This marriage of the game's tech and setting that I call the package allows Rockstar to build 4 things on top of it to make a satisfying single-player game, plus any combination thereof in my view. The first is what they actually did, a thin layer that is the story, the quests, the characters they wrote and edited, with some individual introductions for all the side stuff you do. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. The second is an empire builder style game, similar to games like Just Cause or Saints Row, which we'll talk about after that. The third way, and I want to dig in for a bit here, is the immersive sim route. This is particularly fun to explore, but it's also pretty involuntary considering all of the games I've been playing for review so far. GTA 5 is not an immersive sim. On its face, the game is immersive. When you play it, it really feels like you're there in that world. There are simulations, things move and sway and do and move in physics and so on. There are plenty of events that emerge from these simulations, like police chases you're not even part of. In fact, I think I saw the police pursue other people more than they did me. And certainly there are no vents to be found here, and the stealth mode is laughably underutilized. But this is not, mechanically, an immersive sim game. Not being an immersive sim actually plays into one of GTA 5's many strengths, its ease and access of play. You can do just about anything or hop into nearly any experience or event with very few hurdles. This is true of the older games as well, but those games aren't slowed down or inhibited by a relentless pursuit of gradually precise and inflexible realism. But again, Rockstar North was interested in building a bit of an everything simulator that simply featured you doing the committing crime stuff. If Deus Ex was a mile wide and an inch deep, then GTA 5 is an ocean wide and an inch deep. We've already talked a little bit about your phone. In GTA 4, the game badgered you, even if it was less often than you thought, to get involved with the game's other characters or go on dates. Here, they inverted the formula by making hangouts with your contacts opt-in. And in the wake of GTA 4's persistent activity bullying, I opted in as many times as I wanted to in 5, which was never. I had literally no use for my phone's growing list of contacts as the game progressed, except to order a blimp, or complete specific mission objectives. The phone can be useful, but it isn't very often, and when you do need it, it can be a genuinely awful experience. The web browser sucks, and coming out a year before Destiny, having to move your cursor around with an analog stick sucks. This nightmare is extended with skeezy realtor Josh's quest line. In your first quest with him, he wants you to knock out the for sale signs of his competitor Lenny Avery across 15 properties. These houses are within a fairly narrow but intricate band of roads in Rockford Hills. Josh sends you a text that points to a website that features a map with all 15 of these properties. Clicking on any individual one will let you set a GPS coordinate on your map, and it's the only way to find and mark where these signs are. It's a very stupid and arduous process, and early on you may think, oh, I can just memorize where these things are. But you will quickly realize how wrong you are. Instead, you're loading into that text, going to that site, clicking on the next property, exiting out, driving to it, knocking down the sign, and doing it all over again. It sucks. It really, really sucks. If only there were some kind of Lenny Avery app I could have downloaded to just put them all on my map so I could tackle them all in some kind of order of my choosing. Because this isn't 2000 anymore, people can send you texts and emails even if everyone just calls you anyway. This means the communications you do receive that way are typically not very useful or just lame. At times they try to serve as world filler or highlight relationships, but they're so easy to skip that I typically just glossed over them. They also tend to just repeat what happened in a phone call, or are just spam from stores letting you know about unlocks. In another stunning example of less than useful design, in the game's final heist, you need to pick up 3 cars. Lester sends you an email with locations of 4 of them that include a photo of the car in a scene, and then a screenshot of the map location, like you'd find in the waiting pages of a Brady Games print strategy guide. It's so counterintuitive to the point of owning a goddamn smartphone, like physically mailing printed Google Maps directions to a relative. I don't think Rockstar ever really understood the potential of the phone mechanic, as if they didn't have devices in their pockets to draw reference from and then implement into the game. So with all this established, why isn't it actually an immersive sim? Well, that's simple. Very little of it adds up. It's seriously just a layer away from being a fully interactive immersive sim, a product of the immersive sim kitchen. All the ingredients are there, all the tools are there, but the game doesn't mechanically let you combine things to produce other things. If an immersive sim is a math problem, GTA 5 is missing the functions, leaving only beautiful numbers and values but nothing to mechanically combine them. This game, through its 4 different corrals of activities, feels like a theme park in which you ride the individual attractions, but the experiences don't aggregate except when they affect the skills of the characters or apply to some abstract scoreboard. This is ironic because you can ride a literal roller coaster, and the only effect it has on this game is that it subtracts some money from your wallet. You have no inventory in this game, and you can't pick up any objects beyond the ammo, money, and medkits you find in the world, something that goes all the way back to the earliest games. In a Trevor mission, you have to rush to a flared location to pick up an arms package and then run it to a destination to complete the quest. Unfortunately, in a rare instance, the go-kart I was driving got stuck in the terrain. After a time, the game registered this fact and failed the mission, and I had to redo the entire mission up to that point. If the game had applied itself, I could have simply taken the package out of the go-kart, stolen another vehicle, and proceeded to complete the mission, but the game doesn't apply itself that way. It doesn't have that kind of imagination. This game is packed to the brim with details and options, but little contributes to a greater whole beyond the 100% checklist in the menu. The game makes such a show of something as simple as getting a haircut and populating the barber shop with detail, and getting an actor to motion capture and voice a performance for the barber herself. But then it's a whack to the head when you get an entire 3 styles of hairdo and 3 styles of facial hair, although Franklin does get far more options. It is pretty cool to turn Michael into Max Payne though. GTA 5 is an immersive sim kitchen experience if every drawer were a siloed experience, like if the knife drawer let you play that rage knifey stabby game, or if the fridge full of beer let you stumble around drunk. But you can't use these things together. GTA overcomes this by simply offering endless siloed experiences. You can say hi to people, but you can't dictate what you say to them specifically. If there's a specific activity that you enjoy, the game typically only offers you a handful of those experiences before you've exhausted them, and there aren't any more. The game compensates for this by simply offering you a whole hacking bunch of different experiences, hoping you never rely on any 1 or 2 or 3 exclusively for enjoyment. The trio have a set of skills for doing different things, like shooting, driving, and flying. Boosting these skills will make their actions more effective. For example, building up a character's strength will make their melee combat stronger and more effective. Boosting their stamina will allow them to run farther without it causing you injury, etc. Although the different characters start out with different stats, they honestly never felt like they played that differently. It's not as though Trevor could drive vehicles that Franklin couldn't, or that Michael could use guns that Trevor couldn't. There are no tech trees here to unlock discrete abilities. As I played, it made little sense to me that Michael would chastise Franklin for his weaker shooting ability, prompting him to check out the ammunition gun range in a mission to bolster just that. I mean, it makes things easier, it refines those particular aspects, but it never really felt like I was taking someone from doing something poorly or not at all to becoming an expert. It's a really underbaked mechanic. However, like any good immersive sim, the game's relationship with money is highly scripted. Early on in GTA 5, you barely have enough money to do anything beyond keeping armed and owning a vehicle, which each character gets for free anyway. There are bands of things you can buy, like guns and ammo on the low end, more and more elaborate vehicles, and then profit-generating properties on the high end. Completing the first heist gives you enough money to purchase at least one item in the high end, but then it's another couple dozen hours before you can do it again. There really is no way to reliably acquire money via any other method. Unlike regular people in the real world, you can't get a 9-to-5 job for reliable income. You largely get money by completing very specific events in the main quest. You kinda always have what you need and rarely what you want. You can get drunk and high, but both are kind of a bummer. You can get so drunk that the game switches off the effect. You can effectively get so drunk that you get undrunk. Regardless of how much you partake of either, neither holds effect long enough to really do anything. It's just another flimsy attraction. Heck, GTA 4 let you drive drunk to some fun effect. And then there's your car. And this is a big deal considering the literal name of the game. Each character has their own personal vehicle dictated by the game that is permanently attached to that character, except when it isn't temporarily for Michael. And then the game just attaches another vehicle, or with Franklin, who has two after an early mission, the lucky jerk. The thing is, even with garages to buy, to store extra vehicles, they'll just disappear. And maybe you'll get to the impound lot before the game forgets about them entirely. Philosophically, this pairs with the earlier top-down games in the series because they didn't have a place to store your vehicles. Those early titles moved around so fast that it didn't really matter if you lost a car because you were able to grab another vehicle or were dead within minutes anyway. When the series shifted to 3D through GTA 4, you could store vehicles in garages, and if you pulled them out and the game forgot about them, it still didn't really matter too much unless it was a rarer car that was harder to get a hold of. With 5, however, it does matter because you can modify these vehicles extensively from their physical performance to the paint schemes and aesthetic to some incredible expense, and then it'll just disappear. So here's how the game manages your vehicles. Each character has that personal vehicle attached to them, whether they're using it or not, it always exists. The map points it out when you're separated from it, and only that vehicle. Okay, that's good. You can then buy a garage and then buy or steal another vehicle and place it in the garage to save it. Cool. However, as soon as you take the vehicle out of the garage, it is now no longer saved in the garage, which makes sense in a realistic sense, but not for the sake of gameplay quality. If you're separated from that vehicle, like say you enter a mission with that vehicle and it switches you to your personal vehicle automatically, or if you go on a shooting spree and get wasted or busted, that vehicle falls into the Abyss, which is the LSPD impound lot, and you pay $250 to pick it up again. Likewise, if you steal a vehicle and are separated from it through no fault of your own, that winds up in the impound lot as well. Now, these vehicles will hang out in the Abyss until you overwrite them by buying or stealing another vehicle, which you will probably have to do when a mission drops you off somewhere randomly without your vehicle, which the game often does. This might not be as big a deal if the impound lot saved more than 2 vehicles. And bear in mind, taking your vehicle to Los Santos Customs and modifying it in any way does not save the vehicle from this loop. It only makes it more frustrating. You can't summon your vehicle when you need it, and it's rarely available after a story mission or cutaway exposition. Even if you bring another vehicle that you may have purchased from an in-game virtual website, something the game promotes, the game still wants you to use the character's personal vehicle, going so far as to spawn it in and having the NPC you're riding along with jump into that instead of the vehicle you'd prefer. This means very easily, if you are not paying attention to the Abyss, vehicles you acquire and vehicles you modify will be quickly forgotten by the game. Because I hated these mechanisms so much, I did my best to document some instances of this. As Trevor, I stole a Porsche and saved it in his personal trailer garage. When it came time in the story to drive into Los Santos with Wade to find Michael, I picked the Porsche and drove it to Wade's cousin's apartment in Venice Beach. Since I didn't have a car in town, I went ahead and customized the hell out of the Porsche, then switched to Michael. I do yoga with Michael, and switch back to Trevor, who now miraculously has his personal truck I left all the way back in his trailer. Since I wasn't paying any attention, I went and did a few missions, losing the truck at some point and hijacking some vehicles. By the time I reached the impound, that Porsche is long gone and all of that money is wasted. I did this 2 more times as Michael. The first time was a pretty expensive car I ordered and had sent to my garage. I take it out of the garage, do a mission, and it's gone. And I don't check the impound quick enough, so it's lost forever. Later on, I buy an Audi, customize it, manage to snag it out of impound at least once, but even that gets lost forever as well. Eventually I give up on my dream of owning any specific car or vehicle I actually want and just customize the character's personal vehicles because the game will remember those no matter what. It's genuinely awful because GTA Online allows you to purchase trackers for the vehicle if it's lost or insurance to replace it. Losing your car in Grand Theft Auto 5, as GmanLives would put it, suck shit. Hang on. I know I can do better. Hang on, I've been practicing this for a bit. Hang on.
Alright, here we go. Right, so losing your car in Grand Theft Auto 5, as GmanLives would put it, sucks shit. See? I told you I've been practicing.
I'm spending a lot of time emphasizing this specific thing because vehicles are such a huge deal in this game, and the game seems to be of 2 minds about owning them. On one hand, they want you to buy vehicles legally. They want you to visit the in-game websites and buy increasingly expensive luxury things. And then the game wants you to invest a mint customizing them. On the other hand, the game wants to preserve the idea that any vehicle you see, manned or not, is a perfectly acceptable option. It doesn't want you to worry about where your personal car is at when you can quickly and easily embrace the titular criminal activity that makes this franchise so irreverent. What's mind-blowing is how simple a fix it would have been to just flag another vehicle as your personal vehicle, or have the game return vehicles saved in your garage to your garage. Because what's the point in owning either if they don't work? There are still issues we'll talk about later that spell out the lack of permanence in this game, but this all highlights the Universal Studios-esque approach, or Disney World-ish if you're one of those people, or Six Flags-ish if you're one of those people, that this game takes to present all of its wares, in which nothing affects anything else, and it all falls way short of the immersive sim dream it could be. Sadly, while this kitchen is fully stocked, it doesn't cook much of anything. Finally, we have to talk about the final controversial potential of this game's universe, the metaverse. This San Andreas, truthfully speaking, would be an amazing environment for a metaverse. You've heard a lot about what a metaverse is, probably over and over, but let's make it simple. It's a virtual world you want to retreat to. In the case of ambitious tech companies, it's a virtual world owned by specific ambitious tech companies where they can now own not just an app space on your phone or a website in your web browser, but your entire physical reality. Considering how much effort Rockstar put into reproducing so many aspects of the real world in this game, it sets up a true venue for escapism that mirrors its plausibility in a lot of ways. Of course, everyone who's created a metaverse so far can't really make anything that doesn't look entirely lame. They're a solution in search of a problem. Why do you want to pop on a VR headset and hang out with people in a virtual 3D chat room, which have existed for decades, or play tennis with them, which has existed for decades? Metaverses have to be more enjoyable or more authentic than the real world, or they're just spaces that are clunkier to access and utilize. A few years before Grand Theft Auto 5 release, Sony created their own 3D chat room / virtual space / metaverse experiment called PlayStation Home. And by all means, it was really lame. It looked cool. You got a cool apartment. You earned credits to buy stuff to furnish it with. You could invite friends over and go to a virtual movie theater with your avatars to watch Sony content together. It was like the common area of an MMO without much of a game. But no one figured out why you would want to do this, so Sony closed it a few years later. San Andreas, however, is a cool place to be in. I had to keep coming up with reasons to slow down and just loiter in the world. There are plenty of reasons why this massive island would be a wonderful place to host a metaverse where you would want to buy virtual apartments, buy virtual cars, and hang out with real friends virtually. In fact, this idea is reinforced in two ways. One is the ongoing popularity of Grand Theft Auto Online, which allows you to do literally all of those things. Two is the rise of modded role-playing game servers in which people play as law enforcement officers and capture virtual criminals, and then send them to virtual jail and have all kinds of routines and protocols built in. There is some very serious, very authentic version of GTA 5 or even GTA 6 that could replicate reality in a very exciting way. This game is so interesting to this point. Playing Grand Theft Auto 5 again, I felt like I was playing two games. One that was progressive and looking forward, and another that was regressive and looking backwards in all of the worst ways. The tech is amazing, the setting is incredible, but what follows in this review, the story that motivates the player's participation in both, that very first option we talked about of the 4 options they could do, is less convincing and absolutely less reliable. Instead of building an immersive sim or empire builder with the single-player campaign, because they clearly built a metaverse with its multiplayer, Rockstar wrote the story and characters that became the GTA 5 that went on to become the second highest selling game of all time, and they are absolutely the weakest components of this game. It would be so easy to say at this point that I just wanted a game that was more cerebral or sophisticated, but as we're about to explore in this next chapter, that is clearly not the direction Rockstar was moving in. And if it weren't so aggressively tasteless about it, I might have been okay with the missed potential.
You do this for me. Maybe I'll give you another taste of that clam dip. I'm just gonna sit here a while, clear my head.
So let's go back in time 2 decades. Why did people glom on to Grand Theft Auto 3, the series' landmark first 3D installment? I mean, yes, of course, it was the hookers and all the violent misogynistic capitalism that followed, or at least that's the reason you told people to justify it. But really, that's something you do once in the presence of friends to prove it's real and have a really dark, terrible laugh. But it was in 3D, and it was the first of these games on the 6th generation of consoles, and that was a big deal. But really, it was these things, and these things, and these guys, and this stuff. It was the story, and one last time, I'm really going to recommend you check out the no-clip documentary on DMA design that sheds light on how the series came about. Dan Houser's first contribution to the series was the, script of the Guy Ritchie-esque introduction to GTA 2. It didn't really fit with the events of that game in the slightest, as hard as they tried to cram the respect is everything mantra in there. That became the Houser's MO with the series, crafting the wrapping and narrative in New York while DMA Design, and then later the new Rockstar North studio in Edinburgh, Scotland, built the game. From 3 onward, you can sense that narrative became increasingly important to the Grand Theft Auto experience, and by 4, a strong narrative trunk was essential for the series to move beyond its arcadey plaything origins. There are characters, shows, and an overall style of storytelling that Dan Houser and his fellow writers produced for 3 that found its way through to 5 that didn't used to seem so pretentious. While their tropes felt fresh in 2001, over time, well, how Grand Theft Auto 5 tells its story is my favorite part of its narrative design because it's the most technical and objectively incredible. The game's technology allows it to tell its story in incredibly interesting ways. Earlier I mentioned the game's frequent cutscenes and the camera scripting that allows the game to put you back into the gameplay seamlessly, and that's one of the game's vital tools. Earlier I also talked about the game's lengthy transits to and from and during missions that are dull at their worst, but in a kind of note from Aaron Sorkin, although without the clever conversational back and forth, we get drive-in talks. I mean, if you're gonna have 2 or more characters in the same vehicle in some lengthy trip between points, you may as well have them dump exposition and build some relationships. The characters even animate as they converse, not that you can see it. Now, these drive-in talks are nothing new to the series, but they're certainly the most intentional and utilized. These conversations are cut in a way that makes me believe they used a tool to time the average drive between any 2 points on the map, and then wrote conversations to that length specifically. Sometimes I wonder if the transaction happened the other way around, in which they wrote a length of script and then set your destination based on how long it would take to finish the conversation. GTA 5 also implements a fun little feature where the game interrupts the conversation if you cause too much havoc slamming into objects and other cars or whatever.
Can you drop me off at the golf club in Richmond? Watch it! Golf club in Richmond.
This is a really cool addition, and the only downside is logistical. The conversation picks up again as if nothing's happened, because it's basically impossible to have to do separate reads for every single cutoff in every single line of dialogue, which populated supposedly a script that was 3,500 pages long. For reference, a film script tends to be a page and change per minute of screen time. Tangentially related, the game has plenty of scripted events you may not be paying attention to. Finishing Franklin's first mission, you get a cutscene where you return to your dealership job and your boss is selling a car to Jimmy, who's Michael's son. When this finishes, the game leads you into walking out the door to complete the next mission, but if you double back, their conversation continues for another couple minutes. There are plenty of moments like this throughout the game. But then there are the mechanics of the missions themselves that will fail you or trigger incorrectly if you don't abide by the game's wills precisely. Earlier I mentioned how the game failed you if Trevor got his vehicle stuck, which is something that can happen to any character at any time throughout the game. But a critical point of failure is the game's insistence on relying on yellow objective circles to trigger events. Not only are these targets small, but they're typically inconveniently placed. There were tons of moments when I would park the car next to a yellow mission circle instead of directly on top of it. If I walked over to the yellow circle, the game would yell at me to hop back in my car and then drive another 20 feet so I could trigger it while I was in the car and then get out. With Michael, the game will typically place a mission trigger circle on the front step of his house. So one time, I thought I was being clever entering the house through the garage, which automatically opens when you walk up to it. The mission didn't trigger as I walked through the house, but leaving through the front door, it triggered the mission and subsequent cutscene, which had Michael walking back through the front door. Here's another example. Michael rescues Tracy from the Max Payne 3 boat. You dodge your pursuers through the marina, and characters declare they're safe. Unfortunately, you can't just ground yourself anywhere and move on. This fails the mission. You have to jet ski all the way around back to the Santa Monica Pier and meet with Jimmy, which triggers the outro cutscene. All of this has an extremely easy fix. If the house knows when to open the garage door when you approach it, why in the hell does it need such a pinpoint, precise trigger point for far more critical events in the game? Why can't it liberally paint a much larger area for mission triggers when it can clearly transition you out of cars and into cutscenes seamlessly? But then we have to revisit the mundane aspects of the game again, about how much work the game puts you through to achieve, well, not a whole lot. For reasons that are far too complicated to explain, Trevor meets Michael at his house. They have a conversation and Trevor gets pissed off at Michael, then storms out, requiring the player to leave town. As you depart for the airport in a steaming rage, Michael calls you, inviting you back to the house so that he can continue to gaslight you. Trevor hangs up on him. You, the player, as Trevor, can drive back to Michael's house against the game's will for some theoretical pizza and a beer, and, well, gaslighting. But if you do, you'll find that you can't get into the house and you can't call Michael. You have no option except to drive all the way out to the Alamo Sea, hop in an airplane at the airfield, then fly all the way out of town. On the return trip, you have to fly all the way back to the Alamo Sea and land the plane. It's just tedious, busy work. Apparently this didn't change at all for Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a pretty common complaint I heard. These stringent expectations set you up for repeated failures where the game typically punishes you with repeated dialogue. I never want to hear about anything being greenlit ever again trying to take down Martin Madrazo's goons.
Green light! Green light! Martin Madrazo, give you green light! Green light!
Oh, I'm scared, lady. Just fucking terrified.
When the game isn't failing you absolutely, it's clearly showing you how thin its scripting is. After casing the Paleto Bay Bank ahead of that heist, you take control of Trevor as he bikes his way back to the planning den through the mountains. If you ignore the intended path and cut off road across the range, you can clearly see Michael and Lester warping at light speed to beat you back.
Fuck! How'd they get here?
What took you so long?
The Housers clearly wanted a perfect presentation, scripted precisely to ensure maximum impact, but it's clear how much they needed to cheat or put the player through some hell to make it work. In so many ways, the cinematic aspirations of this game, and every other modern Rockstar release, are both a highlight and a detriment to the experience. But then there's the story that the game is trying to tell, headed by its trio of protagonists. Yes, Grand Theft Auto V presents not one, not two, but three protagonists. They each have different backgrounds, motivations, and social supports. They're interesting, and when you combine that with how well the game weaves them together narratively and mechanically, you usually want to see what happens to them next. That doesn't mean there aren't problems with these characters, how they're used, and the story itself, of course. Ned Luke, Stephen Ogg, and Sean Solo Fontano spent 3 years with Rockstar delivering their performances for Michael, Trevor, and Franklin respectively. Assumed to be some flat rate similar to union fees, but it's hard to say. We'll talk about Michael Hollick in a little bit. While Ned and Stephen have theater backgrounds, Ned having given up acting for a time when his career in LA was unsuccessful, this was actually Solo's first leading role. I think he pulls it off, fitting the vibe of a character who's also trying to quickly mature into a new career. Solo is also an older cousin to young Mayday, who played CJ, the lead character in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Before we dive too deeply into our protagonists, I do have to highlight that there are some incredible performances across the board here. Lamar, Lester, Davey, Steve, Aunt Denise, Wade, Amanda, Devin, even Jimmy, on and on. Turn in great performances among a massive cast. I genuinely enjoyed doing the tow truck missions with Tanya just to hear her perform and play off Franklin.
Whatever, if that's how you feel.
What the fuck do I know about towing cars?
Look, it's easy. If JB can do it, you can do it, for fuck's sake. Come on, I'ma show you. Come on. Shit.
Alright then, shit.
Everything.
Unfortunately, this was something I typically overlooked because of how unlikable, unethical, and irredeemable nearly all of these characters are and the awful situations the writers put them in. So, the trio. Michael is the middle-aged, expert bank robber who started a family with a stripper and wanted out of a dangerous life. He partners with the FBI to stage a fake death, keep the money from the score, and disappear into a new life in Los Santos. He's an angry, angry man, and his relationship with his family, the very group of people he gave up crime for, is extremely toxic. Before they leave halfway through the game, every conversation he has with them starts as or immediately devolves into a shouting match. At least he's in therapy, something that the game reminds us of just as often as his awful parenting, but that has its own problems in this game. Michael is the leader of the group, the captain of the team, the pep talker and mediator. He also has a lot in common with Rockstar stablemate Max Payne, in that he looks and feels worthless unless he's engaged in a campaign of violence. Trevor is the wild card, the hillbilly psychopath. He's the heavy who gets the violence done, even if he has to bitch about it every step of the way. He's unpredictable in that whoops, so random kind of way, oscillating quickly between friendly and murderous. He's insanely loyal to Michael before his untimely death, but it's not clear how much this actually affects him in the decade that follows. In the establishing missions for his character, it becomes quickly apparent that he's a serial criminal entrepreneur, with some sycophantic loyalists who will do nearly anything to make some money and advance his myriad of causes, which are, well, we'll talk about that. He's a vibrating presence in the story, vulgar to the extreme and up for insane schemes on a moment's notice, ones that you will be tasked with executing. Finally, we have the young and eager Franklin. He's done some criminal work, and his scheming friend Lamar pulls him into a variety of violent side hustles, while he daylights as a repo guy for Simeon's dealership. Hell, he even wins Employee of the Month.
You fucking with me, right?
He's such an outstanding guy, except when, he's not. He lives at home with his aunt who despises him. I'm not sure what it is with toxic family relationships in this game, but holy shit. He's ambitious, but he's clearly rudderless and inexperienced, which makes him the perfect protege for Michael. He's down for pretty much anything, and I felt that he was the most relatable of the three. Together, these three are a very interesting group, and when the story hits its stride, seeing them work together is one of the game's greatest delights. It really is the magic of the game. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that each of their phones is a mimicry of a then modern mobile operating system. Michael's got the iOS-ish phone, Franklin the Android, and Trevor the Windows phone, with naturally a cracked screen. I've already mentioned that each character gets their own personal vehicle, but they also have their own unique selections of tattoos and hairstyles as well. It's not a Saints Row level of modification, but you know, it's something. Mechanically, all three characters have a unique special ability, which is really just slow-mo in different forms, building up in a special meter under your map. I only regularly used Michael's precision aiming, and the game didn't seem to introduce it until most of the way through. Maybe I missed it. Yeah, that's it. I probably missed it. Franklin can drive better, Trevor can rampage better, but getting precision headshots with Michael was pretty great. But just like the story itself, their relationships and actions are tonally all over the place, consistent only in their inconsistency. One of my favorite missions has Trevor joining Franklin and Lamar as they're about to pick up a key from a dealer. Trevor steps in and correctly asserts that they're getting ripped off, which they are, leading to a massive shootout. That kind of narrative synergy doesn't happen nearly enough in this game, despite having more than enough opportunities to do so. Most of the time, their working relationships are little more than quips between them as the characters work in isolation in different capacities. Trevor's a former Canadian Air Force pilot, which is how he has such elite aircraft skills from the word go. But his major narrative through line is an ongoing beef with Merryweather, the game's fictional private military force, and the bad, unethical crimes they commit.
The company our government uses to fight its wars and protect its shady interests all over the planet.
They're the army?
They're like the army, only they're private, so they cost more.
This coming, of course, from the guy we first meet stomping a dude to death alongside a dirt road for no rational reason. This isn't even ludonarrative dissonance. This is him both mercilessly killing people on a whim while complaining at length about the military-industrial complex. He goes from daffy to murderous to friendly to deadly as quickly as a cutaway.
What's up, homie? Huh? Oh. Oh, is that how you act, huh? When a friend makes a mistake, huh?
No,
really?
Man.
Oh,
no.
What? Oh, so what? It's just me getting hurt? Is that funny?
No,
huh?
man.
Well, fuck you! I'm gonna put you in the fucking ground. You laugh at me again.
Man, calm down.
To be honest, Franklin never comes across as the violent type, which never really feels like anything other than weird as the story progresses and he's murdering more and more dudes. It never feels anything but strange when he's perched above the scene with a 50 cal sniper rifle or gunning down hordes in an alley to retrieve a motorcycle. That doesn't change in the slightest in side missions where Lester sends him to murder people. Franklin's just too chill for that. I don't get it. On the other hand, Trevor, as a character, is equipped for violence. He is single-handedly the rampaging swirl of chaos that the older games allowed for so easily. Trevor represents the firm want for a tank to plow through the streets of Los Santos and beyond with destruction. But he also represents the firm lack of tanks to plow the streets of Los Santos and beyond with destruction. His violent tendencies and psychopathy stand in contrast with this clockwork realistic world, even the relatively mundane dysfunctionality of his colleagues. These are characters that use violence easily to achieve their objectives, but within the fiction of the world, their friends and family resent them for it. This is ironic, of course, because they will also deploy our protagonists to commit violence whenever it suits their needs.
He really scared me, but I didn't want...
Well, then pretend it never happened.
Okay, that's right. Denial kind of works for me. Thanks, Daddy. Bye!
While the game wraps up a number of the threads it builds for these characters over the course of the game, I never really felt I'd experienced any genuine arcs with any of them. It's as though all three stayed almost exactly the same and everyone else simply grew to accept them for who they are. The game does nothing with Franklin's relationship with his aunt. In fact, as soon as the game hands him a new house, the game forgets about her. It tries to torque on the notion that he's abandoned his old neighborhood for this life of being a helping hand to some criminal masterminds and becoming wealthy in the process. It just doesn't work. Michael's family leaves and then at an arbitrary point brings them back so that you can do some endgame standalone missions with his kids. Cool. By the end, Trevor is still Trevor. He'll just happen to own a few more things that he probably would have stolen anyway. There are many logistical things about this story that don't make sense, but before we address those, we have to dive into what really cripples this game's story, and tone, and mood, and that is the Hauser shtick. Now before we go any further, I do want to pop in a content warning in regards to sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and various forms of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Because when the humor of this game is analyzed beyond a superficial level, it does truly reflect some of our society's worst opinions and attitudes unironically. While some of this was apparent when it released, time has proven how truly terrible some of this stuff is. Grand Theft Auto has always had a dark, stinging sense of humor, but with 3 we saw it take on a particular shape with recurring characters and cross-references. It's as though the game has a kind of cinematic universe broken into eras, but with a lot of the same creatives and actors. But 3 came out over 20 years ago, and even though Grand Theft Auto 5 is not a new game by any means, the Hauser shtick, this distinct collection of tropes and flavor of snark and satirical cynicism, was already starting to feel stale by 2013. Today, it absolutely is, and unfortunately it doesn't bode well for the 6th game if they carry on exactly like this, even as Dan Houser's left the company. The problems with the Hauser shtick can be boiled down into a few broad categories. The first is the series, and now this game's lazy satire. The franchise's culture and tone is built on a two-pronged combination of goals. The first is being a loving montage to the Hausers' favorite movies. The Hausers are clearly inspired by cinema and dressing up their favorite films with a layer of interactivity. Here, but also throughout the series, you see the influences of John Singleton and Spike Lee films, but also Heat and every heist and mafia movie of the past 30 years. This is true even of their non-GTA properties as well. While Remedy's Max Payne games were broadly inspired by the action of John Woo's Hong Kong action films, Max Payne 3 dials it down to just being a take on Tony Scott's Man on Fire, where Max Payne is clearly a surrogate for Denzel Washington's bodyguard protagonist. In this context, it's really no surprise that one of their games, The Warriors, is a straightforward adaptation of a film they love so much. The Hausers clearly wear their cinematic influences on their sleeves. But Grand Theft Auto has increasingly been the Hausers' vehicle, no pun intended, to create realities where these adventures can take place that look increasingly like the one we live in. The second is in the satirical attitude they craft about this world we live in that, a century ago, would have simply been a crude political cartoon series. The humor here is juvenile at best. The in-game brands, props, environmental dressing, and the fictionalized culture entirely might have been interesting decades ago, but are now just on the nose and increasingly thin and lazy. There are so many moments in this game where the writing comes through as the product of that kid in the back of the class in high school who thought he was so edgy and hilarious because he got to watch all the R-rated movies and play all the M-rated games they wanted. But now it's over a decade later and their shtick is exactly the same immature stuff they were doodling and giggling about in social studies. There are a lot of parodies here too. You get simple stuff like the cars I mentioned earlier with their awful fake names. Of course, Audi would become Obey, Snort, Giggle, Ha. There's the watch brand with strap-on time placed prominently in their ads. Tee-hee. The in-game social media tyrant isn't Facebook, it's Life Invader. Because not only does it invade your life, but Rockstar has to spell it out for you in its very name. It's not the NASDAQ stock exchange, it's the Bossack stock exchange because it sucks. Boz. If you hover over a link in your phone's web browser, the cursor switches to a middle finger flipping you off. Do you get it? Do you feel subverted? Do you get the references? They're so funny! Jesus Christ. This is the kind of stupid 4th grade shit you write when you discover that farts can be funny. But then it tries to be a little smarter, a little more sophisticated. One of Trevor's side quest lines involves the Civil Border Patrol, a pair of paranoid regressives who hunt down a mariachi band for deportation. One of them, hilariously, doesn't even speak English. Or look, here's Ammunition, a take on extremist American gun culture with an American flag draped along the wall. Ironically, these stores are mandatory visits for all the crime committing you'll need to do to advance the story or make progress. Maybe that's the point they're trying to make? Maybe it's just stupid. Grand Theft Auto, and then Grand Theft Auto 5 in its optimal format, isn't good at satire or parody. It doesn't even try to engage in actual social commentary, it's just pastiche all the way down. To better understand this, I relied on Jonas Saika's essay on the decline of The Simpsons, and Grand Theft Auto is everything that's wrong with the post-golden age of The Simpsons. I've put it in the description below and I highly recommend you take a look. I've also included Slate's scathing review for Ernest Cline's Armada, a lazy book from a lazy author who does what GTA does, but in a friendlier format for families. Families who don't like each other. Grand Theft Auto banks on imitation as criticism. That is its only simple tool to reflect on the reality it's trying to comment on. It wants to look and sound like it's got opinions without demonstrating any deeper understanding, or much of any understanding at all, about why this is right and that is wrong. The game can't generate any meaningful commentary on pop culture or politics or the world at large if it doesn't understand it. Instead of being three-dimensional characters in three-dimensional spaces, these characters and this universe and the things in it are merely shells, references of what they're trying to stand for. Featuring and then criticizing corrupt government officers or hipsters is not intrinsically good satire, it's just stating an opinion. And just like your uncle who can't make it 3 sentences into a conversation without complaining that all politicians are crooks, they offer no solutions because, again, they don't properly understand the problem. Grand Theft Auto banks on the subversive, but that isn't inherently interesting, and it isn't commentary in and of itself. The game isn't smart about any of this. In much the same way that its various events and attractions don't aggregate to transform gameplay, these characters and quests and stories don't aggregate to become meaningful satire. What early critics of The Simpsons missed was that the show had meaningful things to say about the working class American families. They boiled the show down into Bart Simpson, but Bart was never exclusively about riding skateboards and exclaiming "Cowabunga" or "Eat my shorts" or being proud to be an underachiever, things you can easily print on merchandise. Rockstar bathes in this kind of commentary and satire because for them, protest is fashion, not actual change. Rockstar social commentary is little more useful or insightful than a Che Guevara shirt. And I mean, it could actually be worse. Retro City Rampage DX, the video game equivalent of an Ernest Cline novel, cannot stop tripping over itself and making references to other pop culture entities. It throws them at you so quickly and violently that I actually had to stop playing the game because of how overwhelming it was and how functionally useless those references were. And then you have the cruel humor, some of which I've already talked about, but once you get beyond the childish commentary and bad puns, it just gets stranger and darker from there. There's a random side quest you get that resembles a thin send-up of the Hangover movies. You find a would-be groom tied to a pole in his underwear as part of some bachelor party gone wrong, unable to piece together how he got there. He needs a ride back to his father-in-law's house to clean up and pick up his car. He needs to pick up his best man, who he suspects caused the events leading up to him being tied to the pole. This would be thrillingly unoriginal at its best. But as the duo recount the events of the evening, it just gets worse and worse. They were drinking, they were doing some hardcore drugs, they were acting like douchebags, and again, because these writers have the sense of humor of middle schoolers, they have to use a small person as the butt of one of their many unfunny jokes. Like, Jesus Christ, why do people still think little people are little more than sideshow attractions existing only for shitty laughs? This is the cringiest shit, and this quest is the distilled essence of nearly all of the game's humor. Here's another example. In one of the game's many setups as you switch between characters, Trevor comes to wearing a dress. Now this is funny if a dress is all that Trevor could find before he passed out after clearly stripping down as a result of his typical debauchery. This isn't funny if Trevor's wearing a dress because he's wearing a garment that's clearly for women, and he's a man because clearly in that case, Trevor's wearing it ironically and cross-dressers are just inherently worth humiliating. On its face, this may simply be something misogynistic or in poor taste, but this kind of tasteless humor trickles down into all kinds of anti-diversity othering like homophobia and transphobia. If you think it's hilarious, just rip-roaringly funny as hell that a man is wearing a woman's garment, it's not much of a stretch to believe that transgender people are worth ridiculing for simply being who they are. To that point, and I didn't encounter it, but apparently there are cross-dressing men in the game who the game makes fun of for having questionable genders. Considering the series' deep and rotten tastelessness, awful commentary, and the stuff we're about to get into, it's really no surprise that the game is transphobic. Grand Theft Auto 5 also has very low opinions about women, and there's not a single strong female character in here. Rockstar paints them in very broad strokes, so most of them are just raging hormonophiles.
You need help, like serious help. And if you don't get it, you're gonna be killed. I could give a fuck what your fucking name is. If I drown in mucus, it's your fault, you illiterate effing C's! Finally decided to show up! As long as we are married, I will never forget this!
Babe, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Come on! Admit it! You were carving my ass on the beach! Just keep him away from me and the children, you low-life, whoremongering asswipe!
Did someone say yoga?
While the men of this game are ambitious in productive ways, women are only ambitious in how much they can yell at men who screw up, which is often. They're also submissive, like Martin Madrazo's wife Patricia, who easily takes to being kidnapped by Trevor, ultimately carrying on an emotional affair with him while having an abusive relationship with Martin. The women in Franklin's life, Tanya and Tanisha, are largely defined by their relationships to men. The women in Michael's life are largely defined by their relationships to men. Trevor, the same. In Josh Bernstein's quests, he's the realtor who dispatches Trevor to systematically eliminate his opponent's real estate empire, we discover that he offers his wife as a sexual prize for completing the work. But let me be very clear, this is not me criticizing a consensual act between a married woman and someone who's not their spouse. Instead, it's a criticism of Mrs. Bernstein's lack of characterization. She isn't shown on screen or heard from. She doesn't even have an opinion, even secondhand through her husband. And then there's the lingering idea that maybe she didn't consent to this at all, or she was coerced as part of Josh's scheme for financial gain. And when those broad labels aren't enough, women are clearly in a psychotic episode.
I love working with rubber, burning it, tasting it. You've got shoes, you've got feet, am I right? Hello?
This is some very real, all my exes are crazy energy. Like, what in the actual fuck, Rockstar? In an interview with The Guardian, Dan Houser explains that despite having 3 primary protagonists in this game, none of them are female because, quote, the concept of being masculine was so key to the story, end quote. And I think this is true because they misunderstand masculinity and femininity. But Nick, there are awful male characters too. This is a world where everything and everyone is depraved. All women are cheating, unethical sluts. All men are lazy and vulgar. All patriarchs die in brothels doing drugs. They're all deplorable for their own ways, so this isn't just women being shit on, it's men being shit on too. To an extent, this is true, but in the world that Rockstar has created for Grand Theft Auto 5 and really all of their games so far, men, despite their deep structural flaws, get stuff done. They get big stuff done. They build society. Women, on the other hand, are unambitious, unethical distractions. Not only does Rockstar justify not having a lead female protagonist directly in print, they justify it by treating their game's women like shit. But let's get a little lighter here because there are plenty of other annoying things in this game. The Chatterbox talk radio station in GTA 3 was my favorite there because Laszlo and his guests were funny in an absurd way. Hell, he spends a chunk of his show making fun of womanizer Fernando. But over a decade later, the Los Santos talk radio station is just this long and self-indulgent bad joke that goes on way too long and wasn't very funny to begin with, while characterizing Laszlo as the sleaziest he's ever been. It doesn't feel great. There's a faux conservative country bumpkin talk radio station with Danny McBride as a host when you get out of the city, but I actually didn't even know it existed until this review, so I haven't listened to it much. But then you have a mission with Chop the Chonky Rottweiler, and of course he's humping other dogs, immediately. Like this is one of those awful teen comedies from 20 years ago. The Chinese gangsters who kidnap Michael because of the awful things Trevor did assume they're gay lovers. When Franklin shows up to save Michael, they assume he's another one of Trevor's gay lovers. Not helping things is Trevor mocking their accents.
Was that your people? Ah, of course. So I had to cut out.
There are 69 missions. It portrays and then reduces the role of therapists to little more than clock watchers who jacked up their fees with each subsequent session and are weirdly interested in their patients' sex lives as some kind of central tier to their practice. It's not my business in the slightest to know whether the Hausers have ever been to therapy, but based on the sessions that Michael has with Dr. Friedlander, their experience seems to be based more on what's been portrayed in movies rather than actual mental health assistance that exists in the real world. There's a kind of person, and I know a couple personally, who can't stop complaining about how humor has to be safe these days. They're your Uncle Tim. What would have passed as funny in their time is now censored because of people being woke, or what they used to call woke in the 90s, politically correct. They like their humor to be edgy and mean, and you can't do that anymore. But what these critics don't understand, these bastions of humor don't get, is that humor can absolutely still be edgy and mean, but when you're punching down and using thinly described violence as humor to humiliate vulnerable, discriminated people who are still actively fighting for their civil rights in a lot of cases, it isn't humor, it's just shitty. What Uncle Tim is mad about is not being able to have a racist or sexist or homophobic laugh out loud without being criticized for it. He wants to adhere to his long-held ignorance that he's comfortable with and deflect blame when it's his awful attitudes that are the problem, not the wokes. Rockstar humor is Uncle Tim humor. It's a privilege then to be able to turn off your brain playing this game and accept the humor as little more than slight at best and gently misguided at worst, because you're not the target of the humor. Of course, turning your brain off would make it so easy to ignore the deeper problems that this writing has. So then we cycle into the odd morality, and I get it, that sounds like a stupid point. It's literally called Grand Theft Auto. This is a game in a series about committing crimes. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to embody Joe Lieberman and get Mortal Kombat and Doom banned and adult content removed from video games. Instead, it's the Hausers' odd morality that justifies their inclusion and attitudes on adult content in these games that I want to focus on. There are plenty of video games that feature mature content, whether it's violence, language, drug use, nudity, and more, but it's hard to imagine a game that seeks to justify the inclusion of this content harder than Grand Theft Auto, or perhaps any Rockstar game. I mean, you can kind of glean their intent from the name themselves. They're out there to be rockstar provocateurs who push the envelope and do the stuff and have the devil-may-care attitudes that other developers just can't handle. The reality is that Grand Theft Auto feels like a specifically designed shiv towards the evangelical Christian morality that drove those discussions on violent video games in the early 90s, and it empowered a lawyer like Jack Thompson to cause them numerous legal headaches until he was disbarred in 2008, the year Grand Theft Auto 4 released. There was a point that sticking it to these villains, these Joe Liebermans, the Tipper Gores, the Jack Thompsons, was fashionable in and of itself. But in GTA 5, half a decade later, Rockstar's rebellious attitude that once seemed ahead of its time now feels, out of date. Of course, this game has outsized violence and demonstrations of psychopathic behavior, but the details reveal the flaw in the Hausers' depicted morality. Despite using violence and sex and drug use as a means to an end, this is a game that regularly kink shames. It's a game that shames sex workers. It's homophobic when it suits its juvenile tendencies. It's misogynistic when it suits its juvenile tendencies. No one is ethical here. All these characters are just the worst, and the game's attempts to paint them as righteous in their own perverse ways comes across as hollow, something we'll explore more in a little bit. But there's also something so strange about how the game feels about this mechanically. In previous games, you'd often alert the police with minor pedestrian-related car accidents. Here, and perhaps in an overcorrection for how on top of you the Liberty City Police were in GTA 3 or 4, it doesn't really feel inclined to punish you for them, or much of anything unless you truly go out of your way to inspire the ire. I rarely got on the police's radar outside of scripted escalations and story missions. This is a game that puts a point on how powerful rampages are. They don't feel like kickstarting a chaos engine, they feel incisive and surgical. They lack the power and momentum of the older games. There's always kind of a hesitancy to start up a 4 or 5 star mess because the game makes doing so feel unnatural and expensive. You're not able to easily acquire a tank and cause a massacre. You can shoot up cars all you want, but it's significantly more difficult to cause enough damage to them that they'll catch on fire and explode, something that was a fact of life in those older games. Despite your ability to arm and armor up, you feel more fragile than ever in a GTA game, which makes rampages less fun. The one time that the game ever really evokes it is in the very short-lived Paleto Bay heist, in which you're running through a small country town in Fallout-ish power armor and massive miniguns, as the game eventually sends the military after you with tanks. Leading up to the heist, Trevor single-handedly takes down a military convoy to steal a truck, and it stuck out to me at how ridiculous that seems in retrospect. As the series leans more toward realism, acting out and being subversive feels stranger. It seems if Jack Thompson and the evangelical regressives aren't regularly filing lawsuits against them, Rockstar decides to rely more on tasteless and similarly regressive social attitudes and less on the mechanical fun that's always made these games shine. Hell, this game even makes doing drugs lame. And then there's the lazy hypocrisy. Despite the outlandish, regressive, intolerant attitudes of this game, this is still a series, and a franchise, and a developer with political views that scream limousine liberal in the context of American politics. These views are painfully centrist, but also intensely hypocritical. Yet again, it's important to note that neither of the game's credited writers are American, and even the aspirational views of this game and the series would be considered center-right in their home countries. But this game does have aspirational political views. Trevor at one point chastises an LSPD officer about discriminating against black people for minor offenses. I mean, he's right in the illusions of how police departments illegally target people on the basis of their skin, ethnicity, or religion, but the game is sort of just puffing and passing on the matter in an era, even in 2013, where regressives complain about diversity quotas if more than 2 people show up on screen who aren't white men. Unfortunately, playing this game, it's clear that Rockstar is not terribly interested in celebrating diversity in a setting in one of America's most diverse populations. That is, of course, except in situations where Trevor is out murdering tons of them. The cast is massive and kind of representative if you were walking down the streets of Los Santos themselves, but nearly all of its cast and subsequently most powerful people are white, and most of them are men. Even in a world of their own creation, something they had a hand in producing that didn't need to reflect reality at all, and yet the game's diversity still looks almost entirely like this. Lester's campaign, largely fulfilled through Franklin's assassinations, tries to make a statement about tech CEOs invading their users' privacy and selling their data for profits. Then he drops in a note about livable wages and fair labor practices. Again, this is all aspiration, but it also comes years before reports broke that Rockstar itself paid low wages, mandated unpaid overtime, and crunch, then fostered an environment of retaliation and toxicity across their constellation of studios around the world. Rockstar is a sweatshop, one former employee put it. Dan Houser infamously explained to Vulture in advance of Red Dead Redemption 2's release that the writing team had put in 100-hour weeks in order to get the game ready to ship. Rockstar is notorious for being reclusive, and while they've signaled that things should get better, whether they have is a matter of faith and legality. But yes, tell us more about how evil tech CEOs are, Lester. The game also has plenty to complain about in regards to outsourcing amongst a wave of tech and service jobs being boxed up in America and sent to Southern Asia where labor is cheaper. On this second playthrough, this feels particularly dated, not because it isn't happening still, or the effects weren't tangibly real, but even network TV had given up on the idea years before then. NBC canceled its outsourced TV show in 2010, which was an adaptation of the film that was released 2 years before GTA, the fourth one. But while the game can describe issues with American society and politics all day, it has few solutions, and since all of these characters are unethical and reliable except to chase their own ends, there's no one who can facilitate this better society either. It has no vision for how a government should intervene on behalf of its people, something we'll talk about later in regards to the city of Los Santos itself. The game tries to punch up and down. It knocks down the rich as self-interested douchebag bros, and poor people as uneducated trash or just perverts. It's good to go because it's making fun of everyone. Hooray! It's not hate speech if you hate everyone. It would be so easy to blow off my criticisms, except Rockstar doesn't even treat GTA 5 as just a video game. He treats it as a platform, as a means to convey a message, and it is very sincere about what it's trying to say. He clearly takes a side here unironically, and the other side, ironically, in jest. And yet look beyond its superficial commentary and you'll find it still muddies the water a bit to justify its own awful opinions. It wants to speak out against the evils of capitalism while raking in billions of dollars in profits and shortchanging its staff and performers. So then we get to Michael Hollick, the actor who voiced and mocap performed Grand Theft Auto 4's former Serbian soldier protagonist Niko Bellic, who riled Rockstar execs after an interview with the New York Times. Hollick explained that despite receiving $100,000 for his years of work in the role, he didn't receive any subsequent royalties despite the game's incredible success and hundreds of millions of dollars in pure profits. It leads me to believe that while Steve, Solo, and Ned were paid well, they were certainly not paid to the terms that Hollick was championing. In 2016, the Screen Actors Guild picketed a cabal of large game publishers, including Rockstar's corporate parent Take-Two, in order to gain better compensation for their work. After the longest strike in the Guild's history, they reached an agreement in 2017. Rockstar, chugging wine in its limousine, making shitty jokes about vulnerable groups of people, is not fighting for you or your rights. They aren't woke. They're still just that kid in high school trying to get a rise out of people by being controversial. In 2020, Dan Houser left Rockstar, which gives us some sliver of hope that the Houser shtick can be diminished in some part. Of course, it probably works to our benefit that Rockstar was focused on making Red Dead Redemption 2 in the past decade, because a Grand Theft Auto 6 released in the Trump era, with how poorly Rockstar comments on politics and society in general, sounds like a disaster we thankfully avoided. The story of Grand Theft Auto 5 is a weird, lumpy blanket draped over and serving a series of 7 weird, lumpy, but highly produced heists of various sizes. We'll talk about how heists work in the next chapter. I'll note here that despite the story's inconsistencies, it's a pretty enjoyable romp despite itself sometimes, and I only recall 1 or 2 tail missions and no escort missions, which are the drudgery of the genre. This won't be a note-for-note recreation of the story and its plentiful missions, but it will paint the scene holistically while highlighting key moments. The game drops you cleverly into a bank heist in its opening moments. Michael, Trevor, and a third participant, Brad, are here to take money and then hightail it to a driver waiting nearby. This section serves as both the tutorial and the cornerstone for all the game's subsequent conflicts. No civilian is supposed to be killed. Trevor is supposed to end up dead. Michael is supposed to fake his death and wind up with the millions from the score so he can get out of the hustle and live a prosperous life with his new family. But when the cops descend in a fluke, Brad winds up dead and the psychopathic Trevor winds up alive. In one way, it initiates the conflict that will dog Michael and Trevor's relationship throughout the game. And in another, it reintroduces the FBI agents who created this deal with Michael to begin with and drag him along for a series of quests to do their dirty work through blackmail. The game skips to a decade later where we meet Franklin, who's ambitious and clearly struggling to get out of his day-to-day misery in a social circumstance he didn't choose to be in. In a fluke, he crosses paths with Michael and becomes his protege. The story could have gone peacefully at this point, with Michael miserable in a miserable home life and Franklin struggling to get out of his situation, except Michael catches his wife Amanda cheating on him with her tennis coach. In retaliation, he tears down one of Martin Madrazo's expensive homes, thinking it belongs to the tennis coach. This creates the circumstances in which Michael and Franklin must now pull off the game's elaborate second heist to pay back Madrazo. News of this gets around to summon Trevor, which then creates a series of other antagonists and quest lines. Despite being a deluxe series of interweaving missions that play with and off the individual protagonists and them together, the story is inconsistently paced. There are lots of interesting and then weird ideas in the way that network TVs scrounge for a myriad of plot lines to fill their girthy 25-episode seasons. Like an unserialized network show, you feel the most narrative traction around the beginning and the end, with a blip toward the center as the show comes in and out of a mid-season break. Because of the sheer amount of hours they have to write for, much of the space in between feels like filler, where the story isn't moving at all, and nothing is actually happening. Tonally, this game feels just all over the place, which isn't helped by the inconsistent underlying ideologies and messaging. A decade ago, this story was hands down my least favorite component of this game. Putting together this review, I can really understand why. After a few introductory missions per character that establish the worlds these protagonists come from, the game unites them, pairs them, or sends them off on their own solo adventures along the main quest line. You get a really broad sense that they sought every combination of these protagonists to play with, and I really enjoyed the variety, even if I don't believe the game did nearly enough to develop their relationships. But this variety of missions feels random. I hate everything about the tongue-in-cheek framing of Life Invader and how its employees are portrayed. But infiltrating their offices to drop off an explosive phone prototype is kinda exciting. So is chasing joyriders on the freeway, or following a car from a police chopper. Having Merryweather invade Michael's home with his family in it after spending the whole game to that point wandering in and around it was a very interesting twist. I wish it happened more often. Playing as Franklin and stalking an architect for his floor plans as he wanders through his building under construction is intense, until you realize that the game thinks there's nothing weird about a random guy in a hard hat walking out with the architect's briefcase after both disappear around a corner. But as interesting as many of these random setups can be, because of their lack of coherency with the master narrative, I'd actually forgotten about many of them. On top of the several I've already mentioned, I forgot there's a mission as Franklin where you need to steal a James Bondian gadget car. You sneak into the movie studio, steal the outfit of the main actor, and then drive the car directly off the set. In your escape, the actress that's trapped with you keeps tugging on the steering wheel, similar to the Tiger minigame from Saints Row III, until you eventually activate the passenger ejector seat. Later on, when you're hauling all of these stolen cars along the countryside, you get to use the Bond car to dispatch pursuing police. I'd totally forgotten about all of this, and it doesn't contribute much to the story anyway. Trevor is introduced as this savage, violent man who picks up on his once friend and partner in crime, Michael, not being dead at all. The game projects this notion that he's going to find him and just do some truly brutal shit once he finds him, but when they reunite, they're just chummy. He won't say he forgives Michael, but his grievances rarely amount to little more than snarky pushback. By the Polito job, they're just trading goofy banter. It really doesn't make much sense.
You are a hipster. What? You're a hipster. I hate hipsters. Classic hipster denial.
I abhor hipsters. I eat them for fun.
The game sets up that movies, like they are for the Hauser brothers, are a really big deal for Michael, so Devin Weston, the game's eventual antagonist, has Michael produce a movie for him. Except none of the missions are actually related to making a movie. They're just Michael running around town roughing up people for the film's producer. There's no fun mission where you're making sure people are on set, or shooting a scene with a camera car, or anything actually interesting. You're just punching dudes, and then you wind up at a premiere with a title card. It's one of the game's most disappointing arcs because it's also supposed to portray that Michael has a post-heist life that doesn't involve murdering people to the horror of his family. In one of Franklin's last missions, his ex Tanisha shows up at his mansion in the hills to convince him to save Lamar from a character you haven't interacted with in dozens of hours by that point, and probably forgot about it, like I did. The thing is, if you hadn't been keeping track of her texts and emails as they roll in throughout the game, you would probably have absolutely no idea who this is, or why you should care that she's pressuring you into doing this. You never see her again after this quest anyway. And then here you are torturing someone. Here you are hijacking a massive cargo plane with a crop duster. Here you are shooting down a private jet and then chasing it as it descends across the high desert. Here you are stealing other rare cars for Devin. Here you are infiltrating an underground research facility. There's even that rom-com/family film thing where the protagonists have a falling out after the second act, then spend their time apart in angry resentment before one of them or some third character assists in a way that reunites them just in time for the finale. I could forgive the wild bounces of these story beats, again, if the game didn't take itself so damn seriously. Grand Theft Auto 5 wants to be a high-end cinematic buffet, and it really doesn't fucking work sometimes. It might also be forgivable if you didn't need to advance the main storyline to unlock stuff in the open world, like high-end weapons, modifications, and car upgrades, or to gain the money needed to reliably buy that stuff. One of the game's best ideas is that you need to work with all of the characters as they have missions, so you're not maining as one of them and then tanking your way through the whole story. You have to switch between them, which exposes you to their individual lives and conditions. It makes this world feel so much bigger than its virtual space. The game features a rotating cast of helpers who become villains and villains who become helpers. It also spends its entire time having Franklin deal with Michael and Trevor's villains before dumping Franklin's antagonists into the literal last mission of the game. This slow, constant churn might be fine for ice cream, but it only builds on the notion that as a single through line with a single character like previous games, it would have been absolutely miserable. That said, the primary thread of GTA 5's story really is Michael's, and it sorta just ropes in Trevor and Franklin, making their stories feel additional rather than essential. Michael's story involves regular run-ins with his FBI handlers and doing their dirty work as they continue to fuck up. First off, this isn't very interesting. I don't care about this at all. I hate these characters. I don't like the things you do in these missions. I don't like that the reward is generally, we're not going to bother you for another couple missions. They suck. Even when this thread line reaches its absurd climax, it just proves that the only way to make it interesting was to throw everything they built to that point at a wall. It shouldn't be any surprise then that this is when the story decides to reunite Michael and Trevor before having them back at each other's throats in a conflict the game contrives to facilitate multiple endings. I really don't like this story much. Unfortunately, Michael's story is just a really shitty and cheap way to implement half-assed commentary about international policy and terrorism. This is the way they set up the aforementioned torture sequence to get information out of a suspect, which I will spare you the more gruesome aspects of. Here's the thing, I'm not opposed to this per se, especially in the context of all the other gruesome violence in this game. I'm opposed to it because Rockstar implements it purely for shock value. It's not part of some ideological campaign or messaging. It doesn't build any of these characters. It doesn't add anything to the story. In fact, it detracts from it, and it's just gross. Somehow this is also how the thread line gets Devin Weston involved, the billionaire douchebag antagonist of the back half of the game, because he has a stake in Merryweather. I don't know why this matters, I don't know why he matters, I do not give a shit about any of this. But here you are, doing mission after mission after mission for these guys. For the record, I chose the Death Wish ending that kills all of the trio's antagonists in one fell swoop before the game crushes you with a credit sequence that is, and I am not shitting you, 69 minutes long. The credits here, which run in a nearly single file line, were absurd in other Rockstar releases, but here they are nearly feature length on their own, nearly half of which are just the myriad of songs they license for the game's many radio stations. Overall, the story is just a kitchen sink of a mess. It just keeps going, it just keeps trying, it just keeps attempting to accomplish so many different things to the extent that it's barely coherent and little of it matters. It leaves these characters underdeveloped, inconsistent, and with very little payoff. Yeah, like I get anything out of Michael lecturing Devin about the evils of offshoring income to avoid taxes before they push him off a cliff, when the game has spent its entire length presenting how awful a person Michael is. What in the actual fuck, Rockstar? You use more rope than ever and you just knot up a bigger fucking mess. And this isn't to say that I didn't have fun at times during this campaign, that I didn't enjoy plenty of moments and set pieces, that I didn't really enjoy these characters at times and even empathize at times. Unfortunately, Rockstar consistently gets in their own way. So if the story is weird and inconsistent, at least it blends in with the weird bunch of side quests you can do as each character. Some of these are really fun, even if they're framed in the most irritating way possible. Parachuting, in which you descend through a series of floating gates to land in a precise landing zone, is pretty fun, unless the landing zone is mobile. Never quite got used to that. I won't stop mentioning how amazing the triathlons are in here and how I wish there were more. The game's various off-road races are fun too. But some of these sides are not endearing, like the multitude of missions built around celebrity worship. Trevor helping elderly bling ring kleptos steal celebrity paraphernalia in a quest line that escalates to madness is ridiculous. I hated every moment of it. Franklin helps Beverly the paparazzo get the choosiest snaps in highly scripted sequences and caps it beautifully by extracting his payment out of Beverly when he stiffs you for all your hard work. Actually, there's one more standout moment, and that's the Nightcrawler-esque chase in a Dodge, chasing police, chasing a celebrity, as you try to capture the disorder to sell the tabloids. That's pretty beautiful too. The weed advocate who's pushing some stuff that is definitely not weed is interesting when Michael and Trevor fall into its hallucinatory shootouts, but when Franklin doesn't feel a thing, it turns into a far less interesting series of fetch quests. This is now the second time that I've missed the Epsilon program, a Scientology-esque cult in 100 hours of single-player campaigning. I guess I'll save it for a third playthrough.
Hey, I was expecting you like half a minute ago.
Here you go. Gets me every time.
Onion 86 in the building.
So let's look at the bigger picture here, because we've spent a lot of time exploring the game's individual tools and components. What is the mission of Grand Theft Auto 5? What is it even trying to do, or project, or represent beyond just being the latest, greatest, and most expensive iteration of a popular franchise of video games? Why do you even commit crimes if it's not bombastic and arcadey fun? The game tries to portray its three protagonists as equals in size and stature across its marketing materials, but it's abundantly clear that Franklin never rises above the rank of protege to these two career robbers who revel in the glory of their earlier work, their big scores. All three of these guys are anti-conformist and on some very primitive level seeking some kind of justice against an evil in society. But why do they choose to be robbers and hitmen to seek those ends, except to inconvenience some rich, powerful people? What does robbing banks really do in this kind of half-hearted venture of vigilante justice? What does murdering all these people do? How does that allow the protagonists to achieve their goals? How does their unmitigated violence and psychopathic behavior do that? The absurdity at the core of Grand Theft Auto 5 is that our protagonists, and seemingly everyone else in this world, are so overwhelmed on their own personal fulfillment and enrichment that the very system and society that they're trying to punish couldn't have possibly ever come about naturally. It's a libertarian paradise where everyone gets theirs and there's no sense of welfare or community whatsoever. I talked earlier about how this game, and really any other open world game, forces you out of doors to accomplish anything. But the key difference is that this game still trucks on tracing the outlines of the world it parodies to its own benefits while ignoring where it doesn't. Cities, like the one mimicked by Los Santos, are built by cooperation and understanding. It's why the bigger the city, the more left-leaning and bureaucratic it becomes. More complex cities require more complex administrations, which makes them feel strange and monolithic, and gives people the impression that their input doesn't matter. This can make those same people openly antagonistic to the very mechanisms that allow cities, states, and countries to function at all. The local news may report on the turmoil and the disputes and the protests, but the boring stuff that governments do on a regular basis allows roads to be built and maintained, stormwater to be safely diverted away from your home, education to happen, justice to be administered, etc. But you don't see that in this game. The game celebrates destruction and subversiveness despite the progressiveness required to build the society that's never represented in this game. This is a game that villainizes the power held by a very tiny group of private individuals and resolves it by transferring power to a very tiny group of private individuals. It's not evil if you believe you're the one who feels they're more benevolent than the other party, the game says. This is a game that allows Trevor to build his criminal enterprise out in the open in the most outlandish ways possible without any penalties whatsoever. And yet we're led to believe that somehow this society managed to build this extremely complex city and wasn't sabotaging every step along the way. There's very little about this city that leads you to believe that given enough time, everyone in the city wouldn't wind up murdering every other person. You see it in the chaos of people's behaviors, of people starting fist fights for simply getting too close. Anyone who then manages a group of people, like a corporation or even a government agency, is automatically corrupt. That's why it's easier to parody the FBI and make them an ongoing villain than it is to parody, say, the mayor or city council of Los Santos. It's a lot more theatrical. There is no virtue in the city, and there are no virtuous people in it. Franklin is the closest thing this game has to a character we can cheer for, and that's primarily because he hasn't had a chance to fuck up and fall into the well of bad decisions yet. Or, unlike his criminal companions, he hasn't become as world-weary and cynical. Franklin is Luke Skywalker on his way to Dagobah to start learning the ways of life, but by the time the credits roll, I don't quite get the feeling that he has. He kinda winds up as Finn, Star Wars' other black guy, who exists for the sake of existing, but still winds up on the screen disproportionate to his utility anyway. And yet, Franklin is still employed to shoot up endless hordes of other criminal bad guys. What solutions Grand Theft Auto V does seem to offer make just as much sense. Trevor's solution for Merryweather is to arbitrarily destroy or steal their assets. For Franklin, getting out of poverty is simply a matter of committing enough bad deeds to acquire enough money that the woes of society become beneath him. For Michael's family and anger issues, all you have to do is see an expensive therapist and wait out the other troubled people in your life. Of course, none of this will work unless you participate in a series of highly theatrical heists. Grand Theft Auto V's heists are the primary thrust of the game. There's 7 well-produced, highly scripted quest chains culminating in the game's most intense and cinematic moments. As I talked about in the last chapter, the story itself is really just a rumpled excuse to move you between these heists. They're visceral, lean-forward experiences with lots of tension except when they aren't, and for the most part they're pretty fun. As a fan of watching things come together on large scales, it's fun to see the ways they concoct their schemes, the way they strategize and acquire their assets, hire the hands and carry out the plan beat for beat. At the same time, these quests will leave you wanting not just for more of them, but to allow you to get more engaged with how they operate. The game offloads all of the details to Lester, the character that exists purely to run logistics for you and figure out the bigger problems behind the scenes. You never have much control over these complex operations that clearly took a long time for Lester to plan out virtually, but then also in the game's development in Scotland. You pick the broad strokes of the heist as several feature multiple strategies. You pick who's on your crew from a literal couple of roles who gain experience as they're used. Crewmates with lesser experience take less pay, but also seem to subsequently lose or prevent the capture of the biggest score. I'm sure there's some spreadsheet indicating that employing people with bigger takes actually increases the overall pot, but I don't know. Heists also function as a scripted in-game way to give the characters money to work with. Because there's no real way to gain money reliably otherwise, you work through heists to get a big enough payout to buy things or invest in properties. And sometimes you work through heists and you don't get a payout at all. Different sources vary on the count, but I'm saying there's 7. The opening tutorial/bank job prologue in North Yankton still belongs here, but the ones we're really interested in are these 3, while these other 3 are, well, less fulfilling. You see through these jobs the challenge of both not making them monstrously large and monotonous constructions, the struggle to keep them consistent, but also keeping them interesting, and sometimes they are not. The Jewel Store job is a teaser and a pleaser that unveils all of the game's heist mechanics in an elaborate production from beginning to end. You're robbing a jewelry store to pay back Martin Madrazo for destroying his house. As you play the game, a couple of characters unlock to be used in these heists. You pick a series of gunmen, helpers, but after completing the Life Invader job for Lester, you get to employ the guy who let you into their offices as the job's hacker. This is significant for 2 reasons. 1, despite the excitement of bringing someone along from a tangentially related job, he's a terrible hacker, which limits the amount of time you have in the store to steal stuff. Secondly, this is the last time that you get to pick a hacker for a heist until the very last one, so even if their skills go up after this job, it's going to be a long while before you get to employ them again. I always elect to pump the place full of knockout gas for a quieter entrance, which involves sneaking up on top of the complex and finding its exhaust vent when casing the place. Afterward, you acquire the resources and getaway vehicles you need, plunder the store, escape by motorcycle, and at the end, when you tuck away that truck full of motorcycles, you feel just as relieved and secure as these characters do. It's genuinely amazing. This is seriously the magic of the game when it gets it just right. Of course, this heist summons Trevor from his dusty desert retreat. After planting his flag in town and reuniting with Michael, he decides he doesn't need Lester running logistics in the background, then ropes in Michael and Trevor to do the Merryweather heist. Trevor spends a lot of time single-handedly researching a ship that Merryweather owns that holds a superweapon for the government. They sink the ship and retrieve the weapon via submarine, but then Lester shows up and informs them that they are all so very stupid for doing this, so after an elaborate, somewhat tedious setup, you get nothing. Great. Now you're under pressure for these next few heists to do work for the FBI because... For Blitz play, you acquire resources to stop an armored truck, which is holding a stolen document that needs to wind up with Devin Weston. This is how the game introduces you to him. It's a lot simpler than the others, but it's a fun shootout. Okay, moving on. The FBI needs you to infiltrate some research facility to acquire a neurotoxin, but that's not the actual heist. The actual heist is the Polito score, which allows you to acquire enough cash to buy the equipment you need for the mission where you do that stuff to acquire the neurotoxin. Casing this bank in a small town on the map's north end is a blast, involving setting off the bank's alarm and then sitting in your vehicle nearby, timing how long it takes for the police to show up. This winds up being pointless, however, because once you show up at the bank in suits and ski masks, similar to some movie they may have seen before, the entire thing escalates into a gloriously goofy rampage before escaping on a runaway train. It's truly incredible, and then they pay you. The Bureau Raid is another smaller heist where you need to infiltrate the FBI to destroy evidence on behalf of your corrupt handlers. Sadly, there's never a moment here where you ever come into danger of being caught. You place some bombs between some swabs of the mop, exfiltrate, set them off, then re-infiltrate in a stolen fire engine in full fire gear to steal a MacGuffin in a bombed out building. It's an interesting set piece absolutely, but it's not terribly exciting. Finally, we have the big kahuna, the job that's going to unite Trevor and Michael forever, the elusive task that's been on their mind since the good old days, the big score at the Union Depository. I opted to take the trucks in, which involved hijacking them in a tunnel and taking one of the guards hostage. It's extremely tense as you work your way through to the carts of gold inside, where anything can fail at any moment, and then nothing does. It just goes off perfectly. You just roll the carts out to the trucks like you're shopping for groceries. It feels like a missed opportunity because Merryweather immediately discovers what you're up to as you leave anyway. You fend off against these goons as the gold is being loaded into the getaway cars, and after an incredible car chase, the cars are loaded into trucks that leave the scene undetected. This isn't just a surprise conclusion, it's another shocking relief, like the one I felt at the end of the jewel store job. These heists represent the highest structural points of the game, in a game that is full of authored content. But as we've barreled through these heists, you've probably realized that not all of them are glittery moments. There are heists that feel like regular missions, and there are missions that feel more like heists. As you experience the story, you realize that the game's justifications for these heists are kinda lame. But if they designed the heists first and built the story around that, why weren't the lesser heists more exhilarating? From the jewel store job, I was yearning to have more control, to have more options and to change a couple variables on the payout. It would have been cool to have simpler or more complex jobs you could pick from as you saw fit, maybe in waves, with different pros and cons to your status. That would have been a far better experience than sailing through the dickish story they wrote to get you between jobs anyway. I also really just wanted someone to delegate the job of corralling all or even some of the vehicles, because having to dodge the police with each theft just got tedious. And then the stealth mode isn't good enough to sneak them out, so you pretty much have to violently steal them and shake the cops. I know the Housers love expressing their affection for their cinematic influences, but this is a video game. Things don't have to be expressed linearly. Gamers can handle making choices and figuring things out, which makes their victories feel that much more exhilarating because then they're in charge of the operation. They call the shots, and ultimately they're responsible for their own failures and successes. Making things more technically complex, but then more linear and more scripted, just doesn't feel like the best way forward. But this notion that Rockstar is making you put on thick gloves before engaging with their biggest ideas and operations goes hand in hand with a greater issue this game has. Despite its complexity, despite your ability to steal, buy, and otherwise acquire, modify, and change, Grand Theft Auto V rankles at the notion that you can change anything about it. It feels like a game that could rely on a passcode system to keep track of your progress. Everything in this world is exactly as it is, shrink-wrapped to the results intended by Rockstar. The game adheres tightly to the notion that nothing you purchase or steal or otherwise accomplish sticks around, a thread that goes all the way back to the original games. In Grand Theft Auto 2, it takes a considerable amount of game time playing missions and acquiring money before you can even activate the save feature to begin with. Once you have some momentum on your side though, the game experiments with dynamic gang warfare, where doing missions for one faction will piss off another faction who will be more antagonistic when going through their territory. You can then turn around and murder the people you're helping, which will then help make the other factions endear to you. It's a simple mechanic on paper, but it's a pretty merciless game to get into. I didn't play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, so I don't have any experience with how it experimented with capturing territory there. But I have plenty of experience with how Saints Row, Red Faction, and Just Cause played with painting swaths of the map with your own colors. I've mentioned it in older reviews, but completing a raft of objectives to capture territories and change colors on maps is 100% my catnip. With Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars, you get a sense that different gangs really do own different sections of the town, which you then use as leverage in the Drug Wars metagame for cash, something GTA 5 could have really used. Drug Wars require some strategies and attentiveness, but it's something you can do as you see fit to acquire the things you want without wading into the game's similarly awful narrative to breach progress gates. Grand Theft Auto 5 has this massive, realistic world that could really handle some persistence and truly make it fun, and yet it's so hard to hold on to anything that the game didn't plan for you to have. Even things as simple as the random people you encounter on the street highlight Rockstar's philosophy with this game. Every open world action game has these people and they'll just blink into nothingness as if they never existed. But here they're just a reminder that nothing you do really feels important. Heck, your boy Steve Haynes gets shot in the thigh for a second time late in the game, and in the very next mission he's upright with his pal Davey chatting with Franklin. There are so many times in this game where you wonder if the game's playing time travel and not keeping you in the loop, or if it just philosophically does not give a fuck about changing any variable related to any object or character or at any point, despite what you may see on screen. It makes it hard to believe that the game could accomplish bigger things if it cares so little about aggregating the little ones. There are exceptions, of course, a couple, and they tie to the things that you can buy. I've talked plenty about how easily the game pretends your cars don't exist, but there's more to it than that. I found that I drove cars more carefully that I'd invested in and modified to my liking. It felt like I had a real stake in the world, so when the game kept forgetting them, it became extremely irritating for bigger, more philosophical reasons. When I bought the stores and businesses that served as passive income, I tended to forget they existed because their payments were so sporadic and spare. An exception came when I had to defend Trevor's Scrapyard from the Lost Biker Club. Also, a nitpick. Why are you going to list all these properties to buy on the map and then make it impossible to discern which character can buy them until you show up? Thankfully, the game doesn't seem to forget the tattoos and hairstyles you give the characters or the clothes you dress them with, although it does like randomly changing your outfits to something you didn't pick for them, just like the radio stations, which is something Saints Row respected far more. I didn't dip much into the online mode, but I am totally bummed that their clothing selection is dramatically larger. I know a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense in the main game, but I'd love it just the same. The game could use a little bit more absurdity. You can't even buy or wear the toe shoes they keep whining about through this game. But there's an extra layer to all of this. None of your acquisitions or victories feel like they apply to anyone other than the three protagonists. When the story has you working so hard to defeat the system and tackle the 1%, the game's lack of altruistic motivation becomes very clear quickly. You aren't helping people, you aren't helping society, you aren't making Los Santos or San Andreas a better place. You're out for you, just like everyone else is out for themselves. I'm not saying that the game needs capture points or territory to claim like those other games, as much as I'd like it. But it would be amazing if it bucked its passivity and let you truly feel like you have an impact in the world beyond the headlines. The shootouts, whether in the missions or when you work up the nerve to piss off the police, are almost always fun because they work so well mechanically. That makes me yearn, somewhat ironically, for the more traditional villain outposts of other open world games, where you have to systematically dismantle a defense and capture a point. I realize it's gotten old as a mechanic, but it would be great in a place like this to introduce some menace to the world, to make you fearful of places you shouldn't be like previous Grand Theft Auto games did. The idea of having to overcome that through combat or diplomacy sounds amazing. There's a Trevor mission where you need to take down a roster of your competition, the O'Neill brothers. You start on a hill just beyond their house, which gives you the vantage to snipe a number of them before going in and working the place room by room, and then torching the place with a line of gas. It's one of the 3 times in the entire game by my count that you get to use this mechanic, which is honestly one of my favorites. Once that mission is done though, like so many others, the O'Neill compound disappears off the map entirely, and you're never given any reason to think about it. I'd really just like to celebrate the notion of conquering an enemy, or destroying their parcel in this world, or making an impact that changes the social geography of the land. It seems that Rockstar did experiment with this in a late game mission where you use all 3 characters in different roles to save Lamar from a gang operation in the woods. While it's nice to experience an encounter that isn't as tightly scripted as the other shootouts through the game, it does feel very standard. I realized that the note-for-note, moment-for-moment direction of the action spliced in with cinematics is what Rockstar uses to drive these encounters, but when they dial those back, it's not quite as fulfilling. There's something fine to tune here beyond the fact that this place also disappears off the map once the encounter is complete. Maybe it's still too scripted, I don't know. Whatever it is, it feels like something that didn't quite bake all the way through, and this isn't entirely what Rockstar had in mind, which is why it's essentially a one-off. It's in these ways that the game glosses over your progress that makes so much of it forgettable, despite the clear effort invested in making them memorable. There's a galaxy of content in this game, and yet I'd forgotten so much of it, from the missions and locations all the way up to and including major story beats and characters, because the game rotates them in and out so quickly that my mind failed to register them at all. This is a game that begs to be remembered but can't keep its details from disappearing.
I'll tell you what, you could take this desert and stick it. My life may be a world of pain, but from here on out, it's going to be cool, comfortable, air-conditioned pain. Take it easy.
Grand Theft Auto 5 is a playground, a sandbox. It's extremely fun, but there are very few consequences. It's realistic enough to have weight, but also realistic enough to require some suspension of disbelief. This is a game that doesn't want you to permanently die when you're being surrounded and shot at by dozens of police officers. It also doesn't want you to spend the rest of the game in prison for petty crime that the cops nab you for. It never wants you to reload from a save, but it will drop you off at a local hospital or police station and make your personal vehicle unavailable out of spite. Of course, this is also a game where you can hijack a PMC cargo plane, get shot down by military jets, and then slowly glide back to your trailer without a literal army waiting for you. There's a balance here between these 2 poles, and the most confusing moments came when the game couldn't quite figure out what it was really wanting to do. Saints Row went full balls-out madness with its games over the years, but it eventually found out there was a dead end to the absurdity that this kind of open-world game can handle. So the question turns inevitably to what does Rockstar do with a sequel to this game? During the writing of this script, the Reclusive label came out and said that they'd already started active development on their next full Grand Theft Auto title, which I know in my gut will have yet another expansive single-player campaign while relaunching Grand Theft Auto Online for a new decade. There's a part of me that regrets not having played the Red Dead Redemption games, particularly the sequel, to see what they've accomplished in the decade since Grand Theft Auto 5 released. But in so many ways it seems I've gotten the gist. More technical beauty, more mundane and immersive mechanics, more hyper-specific missions that will fail you if you stray an inch from the intended path. That's not a review, so take that as you will. But what do you change in GTA 6, and what do you keep the same? Remember, this is the second best-selling game of all time, and Rockstar faces the innovator's dilemma with each new installment of impressing longtime fans while trying to bring in new ones. Sid Meier says that each new Civilization game is 1/3 keeping what exists, 1/3 tweaking what exists, and 1/3 introducing something new. Thankfully, Rockstar have proven, I think, that they're bold enough to do something different, that they won't repeat mistakes, especially in the transition from GTA 4 to 5. It's also been long enough since this game initially released that they can get away with a lot more changes design-wise. Of course, this extra decade means coming to terms with what technology and society is now versus 2013, and how that fits in with their new game. Even with Dan Houser out of the picture, they can't continue to lean on their favorite films from the early 90s to inform their fictional worldview if they're still going to try and use their game as a platform to deliver social commentary. There are two directions that a sequel can go. Most of me believes that they'll refine what they've already done and make a game that's more realistic and contemporary than it's ever been. And that'd be fine, provided they address the concerns that I've brought up here. Me, you know, the powerful and influential gaming essayist that I am. But a smaller part of me really wants them to go back to formula, to become more stylized, to go further back in their timeline and make a game where things matter more, where things add up. We live in a world now that this game even acknowledges where random violence feels more out of place than ever. Make a sequel that's even more realistic and it will seem even more so. Part of me wants more explosions and arcadey action. It wants you to blow up a gas station with massive explosions and have dozens of cop cars on the way, and then over the course of in-game days and weeks, it's rebuilt to be knocked down again. It wants whatever character or characters you play to build a reputation beyond the cutscenes, where people recognize you and agree with or disagree with your actions instead of just being an anonymous doobad through its campaign. It wants Just Cause and Crackdown and Red Faction Guerrilla to bleed into their new design. They dipped their toe into this kind of experimentation with Chinatown Wars with incredible success, and they could really do so much more with the time, money, talent, and resources that they have. It would also be pretty hecking nice if the series stopped cycling between the same 3 cities it's been doling out for decades. Is it impossible to make a statement about American culture without setting it in Los Angeles, New York, or Miami? I know I'm biased, but I've been craving a game set in a stylized Denver since Project Gotham Racing 2 introduced a smattering of international cities. None of them in Colorado. Surely they can write a ton of shitty mile-high jokes. Grand Theft Auto 5 is a solid piece of gaming machinery and it's still my favorite of the series, but I rarely ever got an emotional response out of it. It didn't make me care for the characters or the city or its inhabitants beyond the fact that they were represented so well in the game. It does a lot of small things really, really well, and it includes a whole bunch of them. But it's too serious. It focuses too much on carrying the story, which is its weakest component, rather than cashing in on what other far more dynamic open world games have done so well. Why not make the story more fulfilling and justify the lewd acts that the very title of the game suggests? We don't need to have a dour story like we saw in GTA 4, so why not have a protagonist that's truly starting from scratch, coming from a world where violence and danger are encouraged, necessary, and consequential? Rap and hip-hop have been painting these stories lyrically for decades. Ditto the very films that they leaned on for this game. There is a path from slinging drugs and having friends killed in robberies to becoming billionaires and playing Super Bowl shows. There is a path in starting out with your mom's van or using the bus because you can't afford a junker of your own to driving around in a Phantom. There is a way to save your car after extensive modification using the very assets you present in the game. There's a very real fear the game can install for getting caught by or harassed by the police, especially when they don't react immediately. That would make me feel something. That would make it feel like I was accomplishing something. If you're going to be serious, lean into it for all the right reasons instead of just being thin commentary about things you don't like that ultimately don't mean anything. What is Grand Theft Auto without the juvenile, tactless humor, the stale strip clubs, or the joyless celebration of vice that the series built its name on? What is Grand Theft Auto if you put a heart in it and celebrate the diversity of the very nation it lampoons? Maybe it's something better. Hello there! This is a new part of the show I've created because I want to highlight some smaller creators that I've found on the internet, particularly YouTube. I'm looking for essays from small YouTube creators that present unique and new perspectives in essay form on how gaming works, mechanics, how games affect society, and how society affects games. And yes, I am absolutely ripping off Thought Slime's eyeball zone. If you're a small creator with a unique perspective that, I don't know, maybe you want to end up here in the creator corner, please send an email to askthenithreview@gmail.com and put Creator Corner in the subject somewhere, and maybe I'll get to talk about you on the next review. Since this is the first time I'm doing this, I'm taking the nepotistic route and featuring some friends, supporters, and acquaintances of the channel that I think you should check out. They're not essayists per se, but they do bring thoughtful analysis to the games that they review. The first up is High Functioning Medium with 78 subscribers. He's working through the history of first-person shooters from Catacomb 3D onward, documenting how one game affected and influenced the next. He also has fun little tangents into really small, charming indie games that seem to fly under the radar. He's too small to have a URL at this point, so you can definitely find him via the link in the description box. Next up is The Summer of Mark, a reviewer based out of Eastern Europe who focuses on the shooters of the 90s and the aughts. He also recognizes the genius of Deus Ex's Liberty Island, but dives into a variety of action games that I missed when I was younger. It's fun to hear his perspectives as a PC gamer who grew up beyond the Iron Curtain. Finally, we have the Cult of the Cyber Skull with about 2,000 subscribers as of the time I'm filming this. He also covers games from the turn of the century, but he gets in some games I missed and other obscure titles that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise, or even heard about. Plus, that logo is just heckin'. Go check out all 3 of these creators, and hey, maybe you'll be in the next Nth Creator Corner. Well, would you look at that? We made it to the end of another review. Only took 3 months this time. I'm so glad we got here. So good to go back through that game. Wow. Hey, if you haven't already, like this video. Hit the like. You should hit the like. It's been 3 hours. I hope you've hit it by now. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Check out the Patreon. Look at these wonderful producers that I have over here that have supported the channel. Shout out to my producer tier, Lee Kenyon, Yahoo Silverman, and Romega. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, I couldn't really do it without you. It's great. If you'd like to support the channel financially and allow me to make more games, I mean, we were talking to or hearing from Captain Kirby earlier. I mean, he laid it out pretty simply. What's up? But if you want to do a one-time contribution to the channel, you can leave me a tip at buymeacoffee.com. I've got the link in the description below as well. Check out the Discord. That's how I meet a lot of people. That's how a lot of people meet me. We have some great conversations. We do our Wordles in the morning. It's great. I've got the invite down below, so you can check that out and hang out. It's a cool community. It's just kind of tight-knit at the moment. But, you know, maybe it'll blow up. Who knows? Who knows? I love our little community, and it's just really fun and supportive, and we support each other and help each other out. And especially if you're a YouTube creator, that really seems to be cool. Social media everywhere, and that's rad. I'm on the Facing Book, the Twitters, the Instagrams, posting for the gram. I'm posting constantly in the YouTube community tab on my channel, and I don't know, maybe in the future we'll do something else. So, with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I mean, you've made it this far. I guess I should reward you. Maybe I'll show you what the next video is going to be, because I've already decided. Actually, I decided a little while ago, but you know. So, if you're listening to this right now, you may want to like look at your screen, because here's this kind of mysterious box for number 17 that's appearing right here in the middle, and I'm gonna snap my fingers and the thumbnail for the next review is gonna come up, and maybe you'll get a kick out of it, and maybe you'll cry, maybe you'll laugh, maybe you'll be like, ugh, and why'd you do that, Nick? Why'd you do that? So with that said, thank you for watching, and take care, reviewers. Pew, pew, pew.